Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Netheric Horror. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. I actually have several stories from my life that tend to sound scarier when I tell them out loud to other people. Stories with more dramatic or overtly frightening details. But this particular story is the one that represents the most terrified I have ever been in my entire life, even though on the surface it might not sound as dramatic as some of my other experiences. In terms of raw personal fear, though, nothing else compares to what happened that night. This all took place a little over a decade ago, back in the summer of 2006. Before getting into the actual events, it helps to understand a bit about the house we were living in at the time. We had a fairly long driveway, somewhere around a quarter mile in length, and our property sat on close to 4 acres of land. We could see our neighbors from our house without much difficulty, but we were not particularly close to them, either in terms of physical distance or in terms of an actual relationship. It was the kind of rural setup where you have some sense of the people living nearby, but plenty of space and privacy between each household. The front of the house had a distinctive design that matters for understanding the story properly. There was a pair of double doors serving as the main entrance, and the majority of each door was made of glass, framed by a wooden border along all 4 sides that was roughly 4 to 6 inches wide. Each door had a large window built into it. On either side of the double doors, there were also narrow side windows, starting at that same 4 to 6 inch height from the ground and extending upward to match the height of the windows already built into the doors themselves. Once you opened those front doors and stepped inside, you would find a staircase leading up to the second floor, positioned almost directly in front of you. More specifically, in front of the left side door. To the right of the entryway was a smaller, more formal living room. The staircase leading upstairs was built using floating wooden planks, meaning there were open gaps between each step rather than a solid, closed-off staircase structure. Because of this design, you could actually see through the stairs to the other side of the house, into a more informal family room area. From that family room, positioned immediately underneath the staircase leading up to the second floor, there was another staircase leading down into the basement. At the bottom of those basement stairs was a bedroom that I used as my personal office space. There is no real need to go into detail about the rest of the house for the purposes of this particular story, although I will mention that there had been other strange, unsettling occurrences happening in various other parts of the house over time as well. By the point in time when this story takes place, my wife and I had both become fully convinced that our house was haunted in some way. Based on the distinct feel and personality of each presence we sensed, we believed there were at least 2, possibly 3, and maybe even 4 different entities present in the house with us. These presences were not something we felt constantly or consistently. It felt more like 2 of them generally liked both of us and tended to be either harmless or occasionally even helpful in some small way. Then there seemed to be at least 1 other presence that appeared to favor me while disliking my wife, and possibly another one that favored her while disliking me. It was entirely possible that the 2 more benign presences were actually just one single entity that shifted in mood depending on the day. Or perhaps they were the same as the other 2, but simply had moments where they tolerated both of us equally. Neither my wife nor I could ever say for certain, because neither of us ever seemed to sense more than 2 presences at any given time, which made it genuinely difficult to determine whether there were truly 2, 3, or 4 separate entities sharing the space with us. We never actually saw any of these presences directly. We only ever felt them or heard subtle indications of their presence around the house. Getting back to the actual events of this story, up until the night I am about to describe, nothing particularly severe or overtly frightening had happened in the house. I want to be upfront and say that even this specific story is not going to escalate into anything catastrophic, so I apologize in advance if that feels like a bit of a spoiler going into it. Prior to this night, we had experienced things like random items disappearing and later reappearing in different locations, strange noises throughout the house, and a general sense of feeling these presences at certain times and in certain specific areas of the house. If my wife and I had never discussed these experiences openly with each other, I am fairly confident we each would have individually written them off as nothing more than our own minds playing tricks on us. But once we started comparing notes and realized we were both noticing the same kinds of things, it became clear that neither of us was simply hallucinating on our own. Or, if we were, it was some kind of shared hallucination happening to both of us simultaneously, which felt even less likely as an explanation. On this particular evening, my wife was out of town, visiting friends who lived about 90 minutes away. She had left for the day but was planning to stay overnight at their place rather than making the drive back that same night. I was home alone, sitting in my office, working on something, going through what felt like a completely ordinary evening. While I was working, I heard a loud rumbling sound start up somewhere outside. My first assumption was that a delivery truck had pulled up our long driveway, and the sound reminded me of a large diesel engine. I began saving whatever I had been working on and started getting ready to head upstairs to see what was going on. As I did this, the noise kept getting louder and louder. By the time I had actually made my way to the base of the stairs leading up to the main level of the house, the sound had grown to the point where it resembled something closer to a large semi-truck. And not just any semi, but an especially big and loud one. We had occasionally had large delivery trucks come up our driveway before for certain kinds of deliveries. So the general concept was not entirely foreign to me. But I was not expecting any kind of delivery that evening, which made the whole situation feel exceedingly strange and out of place. As I started climbing the stairs, the noise continued to intensify even further, growing so loud and overwhelming that I genuinely began wondering if some kind of helicopter might be landing in our yard, even though I had no idea why that would ever happen or what possible reason there could be for it. The walls of the house had started to vibrate slightly from the intensity of the sound. Pictures hanging on the walls were shaking, not violently, but enough that you could both hear and see them moving slightly against the wall, adding another unsettling layer to the already overwhelming rumbling noise filling the house. By this point, I was roughly halfway up the staircase. I picked up my pace, moving faster, and as I did, I glanced back over my shoulder, looking through the gaps in the floating wooden steps above me and out through the window built into the front door. My view was not entirely clear because of the angle I was looking from, and because the stairs themselves were partially blocking my line of sight. But despite that limited view, I could make out black shoes, dark socks that were either black or brown, and a pair of brown work pants standing just outside the front door. My mind processed this information almost instantly and settled on what seemed like the most logical explanation available. I thought to myself, oh, it is just the delivery driver, immediately followed by confusion over what on earth he could possibly be driving that would produce a sound that loud. With that thought settled, at least partially, in my mind, I turned back around and continued dashing up the remaining stairs. As I reached the top of the staircase and was about to turn around the guardrail to head toward the front door, two separate realizations hit me almost simultaneously, one right after the other. The first was that logically, I should not have been able to see anyone's shoes through that window in the first place. There was a wooden frame at the base of the door that measured somewhere between 4 and 6 inches, and beyond that, there was an additional gap of at least an inch or two, maybe even 3, between the very bottom of the door itself and the top surface of our front porch. Given that combined height, it should not have been physically possible for me to see someone's shoes through that window from the angle and distance I had been looking from. The moment that realization fully registered in my mind, the second thing happened almost instantaneously. I felt, more than heard, the loud rumbling sound explode into complete silence. I know that description sounds strange. Describing sound turning into silence is something you feel happening rather than simply notice, but that truly is the only way I have ever been able to accurately describe the sensation. It felt like some kind of pressure wave passed directly through my body without physically moving me at all, and in the same instant, an eerie, complete silence settled over everything. There was no buzzing from any of the household appliances, no sound of insects outside, no noise from any small animals or wildlife nearby, not even the faint, distant hum of traffic from the fairly busy roads located about half a mile away from our house. A sound that was normally present as a kind of constant, barely noticeable background noise. All of it, every single ambient sound that should have been there, was simply gone. At that exact same moment, all the electricity in the house shut off completely, including every single light. I was left standing there in complete, ominous silence, plunged into darkness, with only a thin sliver of moonlight and faint starlight providing any illumination near the entrance of the house. I found myself holding my cell phone in my hand, though I honestly could not tell you exactly when I had pulled it out of my pocket, since I had no clear memory of consciously reaching for it. I immediately called my wife, completely overwhelmed with fear at this point. As I made the call, I was already moving toward the very same front door where I had just seen those disembodied shoes standing outside only moments earlier. Looking back on it now, I have often wondered why I did not simply run toward the back door instead. The house was dark, yes, but I knew the layout well enough that navigating to the back exit would not have been particularly difficult, even without any lights on. But in that moment, I was completely consumed by an overwhelming, primal sense of dread, a fear that felt like it was coming from both inside myself and from somewhere out in the environment around me simultaneously. It genuinely felt like I was walking directly through a thick, invisible cloud of pure fear. Despite that, I ran straight for the front door, threw it open, and rushed outside to check the electrical breaker panel located on the exterior of the house. When I got there, I found that every single breaker was still switched on, in the correct position, meaning there was no logical electrical reason for the power to have gone out. And yet, it clearly had. My wife answered her phone when I was about halfway down our long driveway, already in the middle of leaving the property entirely. By the time I reached the very end of the driveway, I had managed to explain to her, in a scattered and panicked way, what had just happened inside the house. I kept her on the phone with me for a long time after that, though I honestly do not remember the specific details of what either of us said during that call. I ended up walking for roughly 10 miles that night, driven by an overwhelming need to put as much physical distance as possible between myself and the house. It did not even occur to me, in that state of mind, to go into the garage and simply drive away in my car instead of walking. My only instinct was to get away on foot, as quickly and directly as possible. Eventually, after walking those 10 miles and having enough time to calm down and collect myself somewhat, I made the decision to walk back toward the house. The first thing I noticed as I approached was that the entire house was now fully lit up, every single light on, inside and out. This struck me as strange because before the power had gone out earlier that night, I had only had the porch light and the family room light turned on, with none of the upstairs lights active at all. Additionally, the front door, which I clearly remembered leaving wide open when I fled the house in a panic, was now shut and fully locked. There was no reasonable explanation for this. None of our neighbors would have had any reason to go inside, and even if they somehow had, there was no way they could have locked the door behind themselves on their way back out, since doing so would have required a key from the inside or specific knowledge of how our particular lock worked. Fortunately, I still had my own keys with me in my pocket, so I was able to unlock the door myself and step back inside. Once inside, everything felt completely normal. If anything, the house felt slightly emptier than usual, a subtle difference in atmosphere that is difficult to fully put into words, but noticeable all the same. I made my way back down to my office and checked my computer, finding that it had indeed restarted at some point and was displaying a warning message about not having been shut down properly, exactly the kind of message you would expect to see if the power had genuinely gone out while it was running. Thankfully, I had saved my work right before heading upstairs all those hours earlier, so nothing important had been lost. Still shaken from the entire experience, I sat back down and returned to work, trying to process everything that had just happened. For a couple of weeks after that night, I remained fairly on edge and unsettled. But nothing else particularly strange happened during that stretch of time. Not even the more typical low-level oddness we had grown somewhat used to experiencing in that house up to that point. About a month or so later, our house ended up being broken into and vandalized, with a significant amount of our belongings stolen during the break-in. Between that event and everything else that had been building up over time in that house, my wife and I made the decision to move to a new place entirely, relocating within the following few months. Since then, the house has actually changed hands at least twice that I am aware of, though I have not kept particularly close tabs on it over the years, so I honestly have no idea whether any of the subsequent owners experienced anything unusual or supernatural themselves after we left. I did happen to drive past the property about 5 years ago out of curiosity, and I noticed that quite a bit of renovation and fixing up had clearly been done to the place since we had lived there. Beyond that, there really is not much more to add to this particular story. Told out loud, it does not necessarily sound like the most dramatic or terrifying tale someone could share. And as I mentioned earlier, I have lived through a few other experiences in my life that likely sound scarier when recounted as stories. But in terms of the sheer, overwhelming physical terror I personally felt in the moment, nothing else in my life has ever come close to matching what I experienced that particular night. Standing halfway up those stairs, staring at a pair of impossible shoes through a window they should never have been visible through at all. This happened while I was still with my ex-boyfriend, back when we were staying together in my basement apartment. Our sleeping setup at the time was fairly simple and a bit makeshift. We had an old mattress that had been given to me secondhand, along with a separate camping mattress that I would place inside a sleeping bag, mostly as a way to give it a little more firmness and structure, since on its own it tended to feel a bit too soft and spongy to sleep on comfortably. On this particular night, we had gotten into an argument, the kind of disagreement that, looking back now, feels almost inevitable given how our relationship eventually turned out, since he is my ex-boyfriend now rather than someone I am still with. Despite how things eventually ended between us, I want to be clear that we were incredibly close in a lot of other important ways during the time we were together, and this argument was simply one of those normal, difficult moments that happens within any relationship, not necessarily reflective of the relationship as a whole. After the argument had settled down enough for us to both attempt to go to sleep, he ended up lying on the hand-me-down mattress, turned away from me, already drifting off to sleep. I, on the other hand, was lying beside him on the camping mattress, completely unable to fall asleep myself, still feeling the lingering tension and emotional weight from the argument we had just had. While lying there, wide awake beside him, I noticed something small and oddly endearing. He appeared to be stroking his own arm gently in his sleep, a soft, repetitive motion that struck me as unexpectedly sweet in that moment. I found myself watching this small action closely, feeling a small rush of tenderness toward him despite the tension still lingering between us from our earlier fight. As I kept watching, it occurred to me that he was probably simply cold, and that this instinctive arm stroking was likely just his body's way of trying to generate a little warmth while he slept. Feeling a small wave of affection despite everything, I decided to join in, gently rubbing his arm alongside him, hoping to offer a bit of additional warmth and comfort while he continued sleeping. At some point during this, something deeply strange and unsettling happened. My hand, while reaching out to continue rubbing his arm, passed directly through his arm instead of making the physical contact I was expecting. I immediately pulled my hand back, startled by what had just happened, and looked more closely at the arm in front of me, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. That is when I noticed something even more unsettling. There was still a hand there, resting against his arm, continuing that same steady, gentle stroking motion I had originally found so endearing. But looking at it more closely now, I realized this hand did not match his at all. It was far too small and delicate to belong to him. It looked, unmistakably, like a woman's hand, resting there against his arm, continuing to stroke it gently, even though my own hand had just passed straight through the exact same spot only moments earlier. I completely freaked out internally in that moment, though I made a conscious effort not to wake him up, not entirely sure what I would even say to him if I did. Trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed, I told myself that I was probably just severely sleep-deprived given the stress of the argument and the late hour, and that my mind was simply playing tricks on me as a result. Needing a moment to collect myself, I decided to get up and head upstairs to get a drink of water, hoping that stepping away from the room for a few minutes might help settle my nerves and clear my head. When I came back downstairs and returned to the room, I found him awake, and it was immediately clear from his expression that he looked scared, genuinely unsettled by something. He explained to me what had happened while I had been upstairs. He told me that he had woken up because he felt his side of the mattress slouch downward, as though someone had just stepped onto it. The way a mattress shifts and compresses under the weight of a person standing on it. At first, he told me, he had stubbornly ignored the sensation, assuming that I was the one responsible, thinking perhaps I was standing over him as some kind of joke, trying to bother him after our earlier argument. Given the tension still lingering between us from the fight, that explanation had seemed reasonable enough to him initially, and he simply chose to ignore it rather than react. Eventually, though, he decided he had enough of whatever he assumed I was doing, and he turned over, ready to tell me to leave him alone and let him sleep. But right as he turned to face what he assumed would be me standing there, the pressure and weight on the mattress lifted instantly, and there was no one there at all. Hearing him describe this experience, especially given the timing lining up so closely with what I had just witnessed myself only minutes earlier, sent a fresh wave of fear through both of us. I told him what I had seen, describing the strange, delicate hand stroking his arm, the moment my own hand had passed straight through his, and the unsettling realization that the hand still touching him clearly did not belong to him at all. Hearing each other's separate accounts, both of us completely freaked out together, pulling close to each other, cuddling tightly, while visibly shivering from the fear and adrenaline coursing through both of us in that moment. Eventually, after sitting with that fear for a while, wrapped up together, we both managed to calm down enough to drift back off to sleep. Sometime later that same night, we were both jolted awake almost simultaneously, waking up within moments of each other. I felt a pair of cold hands grip my ankle and yank me downward suddenly and forcefully, and as I opened my eyes in response to that sudden jarring sensation, I caught sight of his head snapping backward, violently, in the same instant. He told me afterward that he had seen a pure white fist come flying toward his face, seemingly out of nowhere, accompanied by a cold, forceful impact that struck him directly. His first assumption, understandably given everything that had already happened that night, combined with the lingering tension from our earlier disagreement, was that I had been the one responsible, that I had somehow hit him or done something to cause the sensation he had just felt. And he was initially angry, reacting with frustration toward me. But once again, after we each shared exactly what we had individually experienced in that same moment, comparing details and realizing neither of us could have physically caused what the other had felt, the anger quickly gave way to renewed fear. Neither of us wanted to risk falling back asleep again after that, so we ended up sitting up together for the remainder of the night, too afraid to close our eyes, staying awake and alert until morning finally arrived. I want to make it clear that no drugs of any kind were involved in this entire experience. Neither of us had consumed alcohol or any other substances that night beyond simple exhaustion and the emotional strain of the argument we had gotten into earlier. Whatever we each individually experienced, from the strange hand stroking his arm, to the mattress slouching under invisible weight, to the cold hands yanking my ankle and the white fist striking him, happened while we were both completely sober, relying only on our own direct senses and perceptions throughout the entire night. It also feels relevant to mention an additional piece of information I later learned about the history of that particular house. A woman had actually died within that same house at some point before I moved in, and from what I understand, it remains unclear to this day whether her death was the result of a homicide or a suicide. That information was not something I had known going into that night, but learning about it afterward added an entirely new layer of context to everything my ex-boyfriend and I had experienced together in that basement apartment. Thinking back on that entire night now, with some distance in time between myself and the actual events, I still find it one of the most genuinely frightening experiences I have ever lived through. What makes it especially difficult to simply write off as some kind of shared hallucination or exhaustion-induced imagination is the fact that both my ex-boyfriend and I experienced separate, distinct sensations at almost exactly the same moments throughout the night, without either of us influencing or suggesting anything to the other beforehand. Each time, something happened, whether it was the strange hand on his arm, the weight on the mattress, or the cold hands and sudden strike near the end of the night, we each independently experienced our own separate piece of it before comparing notes afterward. And each time, our separate experiences lined up in a way that felt too consistent and too specific to easily dismiss as pure coincidence or imagination. I have turned that night over in my mind many times since it happened, trying to figure out any kind of rational explanation that might account for everything we went through. Sleep deprivation and heightened emotional stress from the argument earlier that night are certainly factors that could potentially contribute to some kind of altered perception or momentary confusion, and I do think it is worth acknowledging that possibility honestly. But even accounting for those factors, it remains difficult to fully explain away the level of specific, matching detail between what each of us separately experienced that night, especially given that we were positioned differently in the room and could not have simply been reacting to the exact same physical stimulus in each instance. Learning afterward about the woman who had died in that house only deepened the unease I already felt about that entire night. Not knowing for certain whether her death had been a homicide or a suicide left an open, unresolved quality to that piece of information. One that made it feel even more directly connected to whatever we experienced that night in the basement. It is impossible for me to say with certainty whether what happened to us that night was somehow tied specifically to her, to whatever unresolved circumstances surrounded her passing, or whether it was some other presence entirely, unconnected to that specific history that happened to make itself known to us during that particular stretch of hours. My ex-boyfriend and I did not spend much more time in that basement apartment together after that particular night. And although our relationship eventually came to an end for reasons unrelated to that specific experience, that night remains something we both still remember vividly. A shared memory tying us together even now, long after we stopped being together as a couple. Whenever the topic of strange, unexplainable experiences comes up, that night is always the first thing that comes to mind for me, standing out clearly among any other unusual or unsettling experiences I have had throughout my life. I do not have any definitive answers about what exactly happened in that basement apartment that night, why it happened, or who or what might have been responsible for the strange, unsettling sensations both my ex-boyfriend and I separately experienced throughout those early morning hours. What I do know, with complete certainty, is that neither of us were under the influence of anything that might have caused hallucinations, that we each independently experienced distinct physical sensations that lined up closely with what the other person also experienced, and that learning about the unresolved death of a woman within that same house afterward only added another unsettling layer onto an already deeply strange and frightening night. One that neither of us have ever fully been able to explain or forget. My close girlfriends and I once went out to my family's country home for a few days around the New Year holiday, back when we were all around 17 years old. There were 5 of us in total on this particular trip. The house itself was quite old, having stood for around 125 years by that point, and it sat on a property with a huge backyard, the kind of space so large and so dark at night that you genuinely could not see all the way to the back of the property once the sun had gone down. Importantly, there was no possible way for anyone to enter the property from that backyard area. No gate, no path, no reasonable point of access leading in from that direction. The only way onto the property was from the front, which matters quite a bit once you understand the rest of what happened that night. Getting back to the actual story, my friends and I were gathered together in the kitchen one evening, preparing some drinks for ourselves, and by that point, it was already fully dark outside. We had music playing in the background, dancing around a little, laughing, having the kind of lighthearted fun that group of teenage girls typically has together during a trip like this. Looking back on it now, I recognize how perfectly we fit the setup of an early scene in some kind of horror movie. Exactly the type of carefree, oblivious group that a story like that usually features right before something goes wrong. Then, suddenly, without any warning at all, we heard a loud, forceful, banging sound coming from the wooden covers protecting the kitchen window. The sound was sharp and startling, immediate enough that it cut straight through the music and our laughter, instantly shifting the entire mood in the room. All 5 of us completely froze in place, the fear hitting us all at the same moment. We quickly turned down the music and just stood there silently, staring at each other. None of us quite sure what to do or say in that first instant of shocked confusion. The banging noise returned again shortly afterward, but this time it was accompanied by something even more unsettling. A deep, unmistakably masculine voice shouting out, "Hey, hey," in a way that immediately registered as threatening. The voice had this particular quality to it that is hard to fully put into words, but if I had to describe it, it sounded almost like an intimidating old man from somewhere out in the countryside. The kind of gruff, hoarse, menacing tone that instantly puts you on edge the moment you hear it. I did not recognize the voice at all, could not place it as belonging to anyone I knew, any neighbor, any family friend, or anyone else who might have had a legitimate reason to be near the house at that hour. My friends all turned to look at me in that moment, their faces filled with panic, silently trying to figure out from my own reaction whether I had any idea who this voice might belong to or what could possibly be happening outside. Since I was the one hosting everyone at my family's property, I think they naturally assumed I might have some kind of context or explanation available that they themselves did not have access to. Unfortunately, I had absolutely no idea either. Whoever or whatever was making that noise and that voice was a complete unknown to me, just as unsettling and unfamiliar to me as it was to all of them. At the time all of this started happening, the window covers in the living room happened to be open, giving a clear view out toward the backyard from that particular room. However, every single one of us was far too frightened in that moment to actually walk over and look outside toward the backyard directly, none of us wanting to risk seeing whatever might actually be out there producing that voice and that banging sound. Instead, we made the collective decision to close those living room window covers as quickly as possible, seeking whatever small sense of protection and separation we could create between ourselves and whatever was happening outside. There was something about the idea of that unsettling, disembodied voice suddenly becoming an actual visible threat, something we could physically see with our own eyes, that felt significantly more terrifying than simply leaving the entire situation as an unseen, unexplained sound that we could at least hope might eventually just fade away on its own without ever needing to be confronted directly. In the span of just a few rapid seconds after the voice first called out, my mind started racing through every possible non-frightening explanation I could think of, desperately searching for some kind of ordinary, mundane reason that would make what was happening feel logical and safe rather than dangerous and inexplicable. Meanwhile, all five of us were spiraling into full-blown panic together, each of us privately thinking some version of the same terrified thought, that this was somehow how we were all going to die that night, playing out exactly like some tired, familiar horror movie cliché come to life in front of us. Being the one hosting everyone at my family's home that night, I felt a strong, immediate sense of responsibility to actually do something rather than simply standing there frozen alongside everyone else. I ran toward a cabinet where I knew my father typically stored a couple of different weapons, including his hunting shotgun, something I had never actually used or been trained on myself, and also an air pressure gun that fired small lead pellets, a weapon I did happen to have fairly solid training and experience using. Given my familiarity and comfort level with the air pressure gun compared to the shotgun, I made the decision to grab that one instead. I understood clearly that this particular weapon would not be capable of actually killing anyone, even if I needed to use it. But I reasoned that if I did end up needing to defend myself or my friends, aiming for a particularly sensitive and vulnerable area on any potential attacker would hopefully be enough to incapacitate them long enough for us to get away or call for help. Armed with the air pressure gun, I started shouting out toward wherever the voice had originally come from, demanding to know who was out there. Nobody responded to my shouting at all. Building up whatever courage I could manage in that moment, I carefully approached the living room windows and peeked outside through them, scanning the visible portion of the yard as best as I could in the darkness. I did not see anyone out there at all. Eventually, gathering even more courage, I made the decision to actually step outside the house entirely to check the backyard directly. And once I did, I found it just as empty and undisturbed as the front had appeared through the window. There was no sign of anyone anywhere on the property. No indication of how someone could have approached, made that noise, shouted that threatening greeting, and then disappeared completely, without a trace in such a short amount of time. We spent a good while after that just waiting together, all of us still thoroughly terrified, trying to piece together and make sense of what exactly had just happened to us. Strangely enough, in the midst of all that fear and confusion, it did not even occur to any of us in that moment to consider calling the police to report what had happened. After enough time had passed without anything further occurring, without the voice returning or the banging sound repeating itself, we gradually found our way back to the lighter, more relaxed mood we had been in before it all started. We turned the music back on, resumed our earlier fun, and eventually stopped actively thinking about or discussing what had happened, especially once nothing else strange or threatening occurred for the remainder of that night, or for the rest of our stay at the house. To this day, I have never actually gone back and specifically asked my parents whether they might know who could have been responsible for that voice and that banging noise, or whether they might have any context or history related to something similar happening on that property before. I still, even now, years removed from that specific night, cannot come up with any reasonable, logical explanation that adequately accounts for that deep, hoarse, distinctly threatening voice. A voice that, as far as I could tell in the moment and have continued to reflect on since, did not belong to any actual man who could have realistically been present on that property at that specific time. Thinking back on the entire situation now, with the benefit of years of distance and a slightly calmer, more analytical mindset than I had in the moment as a frightened 17-year-old, several details continue to stand out to me as particularly difficult to explain away. The fact that the backyard had no possible point of entry, no gate, no accessible path, nothing that would have allowed someone to simply walk onto the property from that direction, makes it especially strange that the initial banging sound came specifically from the kitchen window, a window that faced toward that same inaccessible backyard area. If someone genuinely wanted to frighten us or gain entry to the house, choosing to approach from a direction that offered no plausible way onto the property in the first place, does not align with how an actual human intruder would likely have operated. I have also thought extensively about the voice itself, trying to recall every specific detail I can about its tone and quality. It had this rough, aged, unmistakably masculine sound to it, almost theatrically threatening in a way that, looking back, felt slightly exaggerated compared to how an actual person might naturally speak, even someone genuinely trying to intimidate a group of teenage girls late at night. That specific quality has always struck me as slightly unnatural, though I recognize that fear and adrenaline in the moment can easily distort and heighten certain sensory details, making something feel more dramatic or unusual in memory than it might have actually been in reality. None of my friends who were present that night have ever offered up any alternative explanation either, despite the fact that all five of us clearly heard the exact same banging noise and the exact same shouted greeting at the exact same moment. If it had simply been an isolated auditory experience limited to just myself, I might be more inclined now to write it off as some kind of misheard sound or an overactive imagination fueled by the late hour and the isolated rural setting of the property. But given that all five of us reacted simultaneously and consistently to the exact same stimulus, describing the same voice and the same banging sound afterward when we finally started talking about it together, it becomes much harder to dismiss the entire experience as some kind of individual misperception or hallucination. I also think about the complete absence of any physical evidence afterward. The fact that when I checked both through the window and later directly outside in the backyard itself, there was no sign whatsoever of anyone having been there. No footprints, no other visible disturbance. Nothing to suggest a physical, living person had actually been standing outside that kitchen window, banging on the wooden covers and shouting at us only minutes earlier. Whoever or whatever had been responsible for that voice and that noise seemed to have vanished so completely and so quickly that it left absolutely no trace behind for me to discover. Despite the property's isolated setting and the total lack of any legitimate way for someone to have entered or exited that particular area of the yard so rapidly. Even now, whenever this story comes up among my old friends, the ones who were actually there with me that night, we still find ourselves circling back to the same unanswered questions, still unable to offer each other any kind of satisfying, rational explanation for what we all experienced together. It remains, for all of us, one of those distinct memories from our teenage years that continues to stand out clearly, a shared experience that ties the five of us together through that specific, unresolved mystery, even as so many other memories from that same period in our lives have naturally faded and blurred together over time. I still find myself thinking about it periodically, especially whenever the topic of strange, unexplainable childhood or teenage experiences comes up in conversation, always circling back to that same lingering, unanswered question of who or what was really outside that kitchen window that night, calling out to us in a voice that belonged to no man we could ever identify. This probably would have been buried if I had posted it when everyone else was sharing stories like this. But it is one of those memories that has stayed with me for years. I had never really thought about writing it down before. My wife, our two young children, and I live in South Florida. Anyone who has spent a summer there knows that air conditioning is not a luxury. It is something you depend on. The heat in July can become unbearable, and the humidity makes it feel even worse. Even at night, the air stays heavy and warm. A couple of years ago, our air conditioning compressor stopped working in the middle of the night. It happened while everyone was already asleep. At first, we did not immediately understand what was wrong. The house simply started becoming warmer. The usual quiet sound of the act was gone, and the air no longer moved through the vents. By the time we realized the system had failed, it was too late to call anyone and expect immediate service. We had ceiling fans, and the children were already asleep, so we decided to get through the night and contact our air conditioning company first thing in the morning. It was uncomfortable, but we managed. By morning, the house felt much worse. The temperature had climbed, and the humidity seemed to settle inside every room. The children were hot and restless. My wife and I knew we needed the system fixed as quickly as possible. We had used the same act company before and had a service agreement with them. They were not strangers we found online that morning. We had a history with the company, and that gave us a sense of security. We called and explained the problem. They told us they would send a technician. Unfortunately, I had a work trip scheduled that same day. I needed to fly to Atlanta for a couple of days. Under normal circumstances, I might have considered changing the trip, but I did not believe there was any serious reason to do so. We trusted the company. They had been inside our home before, and we had never had a problem. My wife would be there with our two children. The technician was only coming to examine and repair the air conditioner. It seemed routine. I had actually met the man they sent before. During an earlier visit, he had spoken to me about his past in the military. He told stories about his time in the Army and described some of the things he had experienced while serving. He seemed friendly enough. There was nothing he did that gave me a clear reason to distrust him. Still, I remember feeling that something about him was slightly off. It was not enough to make a complaint or ask the company to send someone else. It was only a vague feeling. Maybe he spoke in a way that seemed intense. Maybe his stories felt too personal for a conversation with a customer. Perhaps he watched people a little too closely. I cannot point to one specific thing. At the time, I dismissed it. Most people have met someone who seems slightly unusual without being dangerous. A person can be awkward, overly talkative, or socially uncomfortable and still be completely harmless. I had no reason to assume the worst. So I left for Atlanta. My wife stayed home with the children and waited for the technician. He arrived and she let him inside. He began checking the air conditioning system. The children were in the house with her, going through their normal day while the technician moved between the unit, thermostat, and other parts of the property. He eventually figured out what was wrong. The compressor, or one of its related components, needed replacement parts. He told my wife he would have to leave, get what he needed, and return later. Again, there was nothing unusual about that. Repair technicians often need to order or collect parts before finishing a job. He left the house. My wife remained there with the children, waiting in the heat. Later that evening, he returned. By then, it was getting dark. He brought the parts, continued working, and repaired the system. The air conditioner came back on. Cool air began moving through the house again. My wife thanked him, and he left. That was the end of the service call. Nothing happened. He did not threaten my wife. He did not act violently. He did not attempt to separate her from the children. He fixed the air conditioner and walked out. When my wife told me the repair was finished, I felt relieved. The children could sleep comfortably again, and I could focus on my work trip without worrying about them being trapped in the South Florida heat. We did not discuss the technician again. There seemed to be no reason to. Less than 2 weeks later, everything changed. I saw a news story about a man who had been arrested after entering a woman's home for a service appointment. The details were horrifying. The man had reportedly gone to the house in his role as a technician. Once he was inside, the situation became violent. According to the report, he locked the woman's children in a bathroom. Then, he attacked her. I remember the report describing a sexual assault, though some of the early details may have been unclear. There may also have been discussion of him suffering some kind of severe mental or emotional breakdown. Whatever the exact circumstances, the important part was that a woman had allowed a service worker into her home, believing he was there to do his job, and he had turned on her. He had used the access given to him through his work. He knew she was inside with her children. He separated the children from their mother. Then he committed a terrible act. The man in the report was the same technician who had been inside my house. He was the same person my wife had let through our door while I was in another state. He had stood near my children. He had walked through our home. He had left, collected parts, and returned later in the evening. He had been alone in the house with my wife and our 2 young kids. I stared at the article, trying to understand what I was reading. At first, part of me believed I had made a mistake. Maybe the name was similar. Maybe it was another employee from the company. Maybe the photograph only looked like him. Then, I recognized him completely. There was no doubt. I felt goosebumps rise over my entire body. A heavy feeling formed in the pit of my stomach. It felt as if my family had avoided a bullet fired from only a few inches away. The danger had been inside our home, and none of us had known it. I immediately thought about the day of the repair. I replayed every detail my wife had told me. He arrived while I was away. He knew she was alone with the children. He moved around the house. He left and made the choice to return later. He came back in the evening when it was darker and the neighborhood was probably quieter. He had access to our home twice in the same day. He could see the layout. He knew where the doors were. He knew how old the children were. He knew I was not there. The questions came quickly. Why had nothing happened at our house? Had he considered doing something and changed his mind? Was he still able to control himself at that point? Did something change during the following 2 weeks? Had the later attack been his first or only the first time he was caught? I had no way to know. That uncertainty made the story worse. It would have been easier to believe that he suddenly experienced some complete breakdown after visiting us and had never been dangerous before. But I could not prove that. Maybe the violent thoughts were already there. Maybe he had entered many houses while hiding them. Maybe he had watched families and waited for the right opportunity. Perhaps there was something about our situation that stopped him. Maybe the children stayed close to my wife. Maybe a neighbor was outside. Maybe he knew I could return unexpectedly. Maybe my wife's behavior made it clear that she was alert and paying attention. Or maybe we were simply lucky. I called my wife and told her what I had found. Her reaction was similar to mine. We both felt sick. She began remembering the time he spent in the house. Small things that had seemed harmless now felt different. Where had he stood? What questions had he asked? Had he looked around more than necessary? Did he know I was out of town? My wife may have mentioned my work trip during normal conversation. Perhaps he saw luggage missing or noticed there was no other adult man in the home. There was no way to examine every detail without becoming consumed by it. The service call had seemed completely ordinary. That was part of what frightened us. Danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes a dangerous person arrives in a company vehicle, wearing a uniform and carrying tools. They have an appointment. They know your name and address. You open the door because you asked them to come. We had trusted the company, and through that trust, we had allowed him access to the most important people in my life. I kept thinking about how normal he appeared during the visit. He did his job. He identified the problem. He explained the repair. He went for parts. He returned and completed the work. That routine behavior could exist beside whatever made him capable of the later attack. People often imagine dangerous individuals as visibly threatening. They expect them to look wild, speak violently, or behave in a way that sends everyone running. The truth is more frightening. Some people can appear normal long enough to be invited inside. The article also filled me with guilt, even though I knew logically that I had not caused anything. I had left for Atlanta because I believed my family was safe. I had met the technician before and had not objected to him returning. I had accepted the small feeling that something was off and dismissed it. I kept asking myself whether I should have trusted that feeling. What had I noticed? Was there a warning I ignored? If I had asked the company to send someone else, would it have made any real difference? At our home, nothing happened. At another woman's home, something terrible did. That created a strange and painful mixture of relief and shame. I was grateful my wife and children were safe. At the same time, I felt awful for the woman who was attacked. She had probably made the same reasonable decision we did. Something in her home needed repair. She called a professional company. A technician arrived. She opened the door. There was nothing careless about that. She was not responsible for the violence committed against her. Her children were not responsible either. They had to experience the terror of being locked away while their mother was attacked. Thinking about them made the story difficult to read. I pictured my own children in a locked bathroom. I imagined my wife on the other side of the door, unable to protect them or call for help. I thought about being in Atlanta, completely unaware. Maybe I would have called her and received no answer. Perhaps I would have assumed she was busy with the repair. Hours could have passed before anyone realized something was wrong. Those thoughts stayed with me for weeks. I had trouble sleeping. I would lie awake and replay possible versions of what might have happened. In one, he locked my children in a bathroom. In another, one of them tried to protect their mother. I imagined my wife trying to reach a phone or run outside. I pictured myself receiving a call from the police while sitting in a hotel room in another state. None of those things happened, but my mind kept creating them. That is what a near miss can do. There is no actual event to process, so the mind invents every possible version. You become frightened by something that did not happen, while knowing it easily could have. I also kept remembering the moment when he told me about his Army background. At the time, it had seemed like normal conversation. After the arrest, those stories took on a different feeling. I wondered whether they had been true. Maybe they were. Many veterans are good and trustworthy people, and military service does not explain violent behavior. But I questioned why he had shared those details and whether he used them to make customers feel comfortable. A veteran background often creates an immediate sense of respect and trust. Perhaps he understood that. Or perhaps I was only examining everything through the fear that came later. That was the problem. Once I knew what he had done, every previous interaction became suspicious. A harmless comment felt calculated. An awkward look felt threatening. The strange feeling I had around him seemed like a warning. But memory changes when new information arrives. I cannot honestly say I knew he was dangerous. I only knew he seemed slightly off. If I had believed my family was at risk, I never would have allowed him inside. For a while, I followed the case as closely as I could. I wanted to know what had happened and whether the woman and her children were safe. I wanted the company to explain how someone capable of such violence had been sent alone into customers' homes. Had there been previous complaints? Had he behaved strangely with other clients? Did anyone at the company notice a change in him? I do not remember receiving clear answers. Companies perform background checks and rely on employees to behave professionally, but no system can perfectly predict what someone might do. A person may have no criminal history before committing a serious crime. They can pass every check and still become dangerous. That realization did not make me feel better. It only showed how vulnerable families can be when strangers need access to the home. After that incident, I made a personal rule. I would never again allow anyone to perform work inside my house while I was away. If a repair technician, contractor, cable installer, or any other worker needed to enter, I would be there. Maybe that rule was not always practical. My wife was an adult and fully capable of handling appointments. The technician's actions were not her fault, and my presence would not guarantee safety. Still, I could not ignore the fear. Being there gave me a sense of control. At the very least, no worker would find my wife alone with 2 young children. I also became more careful about who entered the house. I asked for names before appointments. I checked company identification. I made sure someone knew when a worker arrived and when they left. I kept my phone nearby. These precautions may sound excessive, but they helped me feel that I was doing something. The experience changed my view of trust. Before, a uniform and company vehicle were enough. Afterward, I understood that they only showed that a person had access through an employer. They did not guarantee character. Most service workers are honest people doing difficult jobs. They enter homes every day without causing harm. I did not begin treating every technician like a criminal, but I stopped assuming that a professional role automatically made someone safe. Years later, I still think about how close the timing was. Less than 2 weeks. That is not a long period. The technician who repaired our air conditioner and the man arrested after attacking another customer were not separated by years of decline. They were almost the same person at almost the same moment. When he stood in our home, whatever led to the later attack may already have been developing. We were not looking at someone who would become dangerous in some distant future. We may have been looking at someone who was already close to the edge. That thought remains difficult to accept. My wife never did anything wrong. She followed a normal process. She opened the door for a technician sent by a company we trusted. She stayed with our children while he worked. She had no reason to believe she was in danger. The woman in the other house probably did the same thing. The difference between their experiences may have been nothing more than timing. That is the part that still makes my stomach turn. We often imagine safety as the result of good decisions. Lock the doors. Choose a reputable company. Use a service contract. Do not invite unknown people inside. We did those things. The other woman may have done them too. Sometimes people are harmed not because they were careless, but because someone else chose to abuse trust. I do not know whether the technician suffered a mental breakdown, whether alcohol or drugs were involved, or whether he had planned the attack. I do not know if he had harmed anyone before. I only know what was reported and what I personally experienced. He entered my house. He spent time with my wife and young children while I was hundreds of miles away. Less than 2 weeks later, he entered another woman's home during a service call, locked her children in a bathroom, and violently attacked her. Those facts are enough. For weeks after learning about the arrest, I would look at the repaired air conditioner and remember him standing there. The system worked perfectly. Cold air moved through the house. The repair had been successful. Yet the comfort it provided became connected to a frightening memory. The man had done exactly what he was hired to do at our house. Then he had used the same job to gain entry to another home. I felt grateful every time I looked at my wife and children, but that gratitude came with guilt. Why were we spared? Why was the other family not? There was no fair answer. Luck does not choose the people who deserve safety. The woman he attacked did not deserve what happened. Her children did not deserve it. My family was not protected because we were more careful or more worthy. We simply happened to be the house where he completed the repair and left. That is what made the incident so unsettling. There was no heroic action. No one recognized the danger and stopped it. We did not escape through clever thinking. Nothing happened because, for reasons we will never know, he did not act against us. We were safe without realizing we needed to be saved. Even now, whenever someone comes to repair something inside our home, I think about that technician. I watch the worker more closely. I remain nearby. I do not leave my family alone with them. Most appointments end normally, just as his did. The person fixes the problem, receives payment, and leaves. But I no longer confuse an ordinary ending with proof that danger was never present. Sometimes you only learn how close you came after the person walks out of your life. I still remember the exact physical reaction I had when I saw his photograph in the news. The cold feeling across my skin. The tightness in my stomach. The sudden understanding that this man had known where my children slept. He had been close enough to hear them speak. He had seen my wife alone. He had returned after dark, and less than 2 weeks later, another family experienced the nightmare that could have happened to us. I will always be grateful that my wife and children were unharmed. I will also always feel sorrow for the woman who was not as fortunate. Her suffering became the reason we understood the danger we had unknowingly allowed into our home. We did not hear a gunshot. We did not see the bullet. We only learned later that it had passed close enough for us to feel the air. When I was 16, I came home and immediately knew something was wrong. The house did not sound normal. There were raised voices, heavy movement, and the kind of noise that makes your body tense before your mind fully understands what is happening. It was not a simple argument. It sounded physical. I moved quickly through the house, trying to understand where everyone was. The first person I found was my little sister. She was hiding in her bedroom, pressed into a corner and holding the phone. She had called the police, but she was so frightened that she could not speak. She was completely frozen. Her face was pale, and her whole body looked tense. She held the phone close, but no words came out. I could hear someone on the other end trying to ask questions. My sister was too scared to answer them. I took the phone from her. The dispatcher asked me what was happening. I tried to explain, but I did not know much yet. I had only just arrived home. I had not seen how the fight started, how long it had been going on, or whether anyone had a weapon. They asked questions I could not answer. Was anyone injured? Were there weapons? Who was attacking whom? How long had they been fighting? I did not know. All I knew was that my parents were somewhere in the house, my little sister was terrified, and the sounds coming from the kitchen or laundry room were getting worse. I told the dispatcher what I could. Then, I left my sister in her room and went to find my parents. Looking back, part of me wishes I had stayed with my sister and waited for the police. But I was 16. I heard my mother in danger, and I reacted before thinking about what could happen to me. I went toward the kitchen. That was where I saw them. My father had hold of my mother. He was keeping her close to him so she could not easily get away. In his other hand, he was holding an iron above her. It was a full-size clothes iron, heavy and solid. He had it raised as though he might bring it down on her. For 1 second, I stopped. The scene did not make sense. An iron was an ordinary household object. It belonged in the laundry room, sitting beside folded clothes or resting on an ironing board. It was something used to smooth shirts. In my father's hand, it had become a weapon. My mother was trying to protect herself. The only thing she had was a tiny travel-sized spray bottle filled with water. It was so small that it almost looked ridiculous compared with the iron. It was the kind of bottle people carry in a purse or use while traveling. You could hold the entire thing in one hand. That was all she had managed to grab. The fight had apparently started in or near the laundry room, and the little bottle must have been the first thing within reach. She had probably grabbed it without thinking. Maybe she sprayed him in the face, hoping the water would make him blink or loosen his grip. Maybe she held it up because she needed something, anything, between herself and the iron. There was no way that bottle could truly protect her. Still, she held on to it. That is the image I remember most clearly. My father holding a heavy iron above her. My mother trapped in his grip. And in her hand, that tiny spray bottle. I stepped between them. I do not remember deciding to do it. One moment I was standing near the doorway, and the next I was moving toward them. I placed myself between my father and my mother. I was terrified, but I tried not to show it. I knew that if I screamed at him or tried to fight him, he might become even more violent. So I spoke to him. I told him to put the iron down. I tried to sound calm. I do not remember the exact words. Maybe I said his name. Maybe I told him the police were coming. Maybe I reminded him that I was his daughter and that he needed to stop. I remember watching the iron. It was above us, close enough that I could see the bottom of it. I kept thinking that if he swung it, I would be hit too, but I stayed between them. I continued talking. My mother was behind me, or partly beside me, still holding the little bottle. My father was angry and breathing hard. His face looked different from the father I knew. There was so much rage in him that I was not sure he understood what he was about to do. I kept asking him to put the iron down. For a few seconds, nothing changed. Those seconds felt much longer. I could hear my own voice, but it sounded far away. I was aware that my little sister was still in her bedroom. I knew the police were on their way. I also knew they might not arrive before my father used the iron. Everything depended on what happened in that room. Eventually, he lowered it. I kept speaking until he finally put the iron down. I do not remember whether he placed it on a counter, the floor, or the ironing board. I only remember the relief of seeing it leave his hand. The danger did not disappear completely. He was still angry. My parents were still in the same house. But the iron was no longer raised over my mother's head. I had managed to create enough of a pause for the situation to stop getting worse. The police arrived soon afterward. By then, my mind was moving strangely. Everything felt too clear and not clear enough at the same time. I could see small details, like the spray bottle in my mother's hand. But I had trouble understanding the full event. Officers came inside and separated everyone. They asked questions. My sister had to explain what she heard and saw. My mother had to describe the fight. My father had his own version. I told them what I had seen when I entered the kitchen. I said he was holding an iron above my mother. I said he had hold of her. I said I stepped between them and talked him into putting it down. The officers probably asked whether anyone was hurt. I do not remember every answer. The clearest parts of the memory are not the police or the conversation afterward. They are the moments before help arrived. My sister unable to speak into the phone. My father's arm raised, my mother's hand wrapped around that tiny bottle. For a long time, I wondered how the fight had reached that point. I had not been there when it began. I only knew it started around the laundry room. Maybe they had been arguing about something small. Maybe the argument had been building for days or years. Family violence often looks sudden to the person who walks in halfway through it. But there is usually a history beneath the final moment. Whatever started it, the situation became physical. My father grabbed my mother. She reached for the first object she could find. He picked up the iron. By the time I came home, my little sister had already hidden in her room and called the police. That meant the fight had become frightening enough for a child to believe someone might be seriously injured or killed. My sister's reaction stayed with me too. She had done the right thing. She found a phone and called for help. But when the dispatcher answered, fear took away her voice. People often imagine that during an emergency, they will speak clearly and give every useful detail. They believe they will remember the address, describe the weapon, and answer questions calmly. Sometimes the body refuses. My sister was not weak. She was overwhelmed. She was a child listening to her parents fight violently in the next room. She had enough strength to make the call, but not enough to speak after someone answered. When I took the phone, I also could not provide everything the dispatcher needed. I had no idea whether the iron was already involved. I did not know whether anyone was bleeding. I did not know how long my father had been attacking my mother. I only knew I had to find her. The decision to walk toward the fight could have ended badly. My father might have turned on me. He could have swung the iron when I stepped between them. He might have pushed me aside and continued attacking my mother. At 16, I did not fully understand how dangerous it was. I knew he could hurt me. But that possibility seemed less important than the fact that he might kill her. I felt that someone had to stand between them. There was no other adult there. My sister was too frightened to leave her room. The police were still on the way. So I did it. I do not think of myself as brave when I remember it. Mostly, I remember being scared. My legs felt weak. My voice did not feel powerful. I was not confident that he would listen. I did not have a plan. Bravery is often described as feeling strong and fearless. That is not what it felt like. It felt like moving while every part of me wanted to stop. It felt like speaking calmly, because screaming might make things worse. It felt like watching a heavy object above my mother and knowing I had no real way to stop it if my father decided to use it. I simply kept talking. Somehow, it worked. The iron went down. My mother survived. My sister survived. I survived. But the scene remained in my mind. For years afterward, the object that brought the memory back was not the iron. It was the spray bottle. Irons are heavy and dangerous when used as weapons. It makes sense that seeing one might remind me of that day. But for some reason, the small bottle affected me more. Whenever I saw one in a store, hotel, travel bag, or bathroom, I thought about my mother. I pictured her in the laundry room, reaching for the only thing close enough to grab. I imagined how frightened she must have been. She knew the bottle could not stop him. It could not block the iron. It could not overpower him. But when someone is fighting for their life, they use whatever is available. The bottle was small, but picking it up meant she had not given up. She was trying to defend herself. Maybe she sprayed water into his eyes. Maybe she used it to distract him. Maybe she held it because having something in her hand felt better than having nothing. That little object represented both her fear and her courage. She must have known how helpless she looked. A woman facing a man with an iron, holding a bottle that could fit in her pocket. But helpless is not the same as surrendering. She fought with what she had. When I think about her now, I think about that. I do not remember what she wore that day. I do not remember the exact words my father shouted. I do not remember what the police said when they entered. But I remember her fingers around that bottle. I remember the clear or light-colored plastic. I remember how tiny it looked. Sometimes the smallest detail becomes the part the mind refuses to release. Maybe it was easier to focus on the bottle than on the possibility that my father might have killed my mother. The bottle was simple. It was something I could see and understand. The rest of the situation was too large. At 16, I was trying to accept that one parent had become dangerous and the other might die. That is not something a child can process in one afternoon, so perhaps my memory chose the bottle. It became a symbol for everything I could not fully understand. It represented the laundry room where the fight began. It represented my mother trying to survive. It represented how little protection she had. It represented the few minutes before I arrived. Even now, when I see a travel-sized spray bottle, I sometimes feel the same tightness in my chest. The memory returns instantly. I do not have to search for it. 1 second, I am looking at an ordinary object, and the next, I am 16 again, standing in the kitchen. My father is holding the iron. My mother is trapped. My sister is crying in another room. I am trying to keep my voice steady. I tell him to put it down. I have wondered what might have happened if I came home 5 minutes later. Maybe the police would have arrived first. Maybe my mother would have escaped. Or maybe the iron would have come down. That possibility is difficult to think about. The timing mattered. I happened to come home while the fight was still happening. I happened to find my sister before going to the kitchen. I took over the call long enough to give the dispatcher information. Then, I reached my parents while my father was still deciding what to do. There are moments when a family's entire future depends on a few seconds. That day may have been one of them. If my father had not listened to me, my mother could have been severely injured or killed. My little sister and I could have lost her. My father could have spent the rest of his life in prison. Our family would have been destroyed in a different and permanent way. Instead, he put the iron down. That does not erase what he did. Stopping before the final act does not make the threat harmless. He held my mother while raising a heavy object over her. She believed she needed to defend herself. My sister was terrified enough to call the police. Those facts remain. Violence changes a family even when everyone survives. Afterward, it becomes difficult to see ordinary rooms and objects in the same way. The kitchen becomes the place where you stood between your parents. The laundry room becomes the place where the fight began. An iron becomes something that could have ended a life. A small bottle becomes proof of how desperate someone was. Home is supposed to protect you from the outside world. When violence happens inside it, there is nowhere for the fear to go. The walls hold the memory. You can replace furniture, move things around, and continue living there, but you still know what happened in that space. I do not know how my sister remembered the event. Her experience was different from mine. She was already in the house when the fight started. She may have heard more than I did. She had enough fear to hide in her room. She picked up the phone and called the police alone. Then she sat there, unable to speak, while strangers on the other end tried to understand the emergency. I went directly to her when I arrived, and I think that mattered. Before I knew anything else, I knew she needed help. I took the phone because she could not continue. Then I left her again to face another part of the emergency. I sometimes wonder whether she heard everything that happened in the kitchen. Maybe she heard my voice trying to calm our father. Maybe she heard the iron being set down. Maybe she heard the officers enter. She may have believed at any moment that one of us had been killed. Children who witness violence often carry memories adults do not realize they have. My mother's experience was different too. She had been the one physically trapped. She had to look at the iron above her. She had to decide whether the tiny bottle was worth using. She had to see her 16-year-old child step between her and her husband. I wonder how she felt when I did that. Relieved, probably, but also terrified for me. A parent wants to protect their child. In that moment, I was protecting her. She may have feared that my father would strike me instead. She may have wanted to tell me to run. But there was no time for a long conversation. We were all reacting. My father's actions affected every person in the house. One child froze with the police on the phone. Another child placed herself between two adults. A mother tried to defend herself with a tiny bottle. All of that happened because he chose violence. I have heard people minimize domestic fights by saying both people were emotional, or that family arguments sometimes get out of control. That description does not fit what I saw. There is a difference between two people shouting and one person holding an iron above someone who cannot get away. There is a difference between an argument and a situation that makes a child call the police. There is a difference between anger and a threat that can kill. My mother did not have an equal weapon. She did not have control. She had a small bottle of water. That image makes the difference clear. She was not participating in a fair fight. She was trying to survive one. I do not know whether my father understood the seriousness of that moment afterward. Maybe he apologized. Maybe he blamed anger, stress, or something my mother said. Maybe he claimed he would never actually have used the iron. People often say that after someone stops them. They say they were only trying to scare the other person. They say they lost control. But holding a weapon over someone is already an act of violence. My mother had no way to know he would stop. My sister had no way to know. I had no way to know. That uncertainty is what made it terrifying. I sometimes think about how calm I tried to sound. Inside, I was panicking. But I believe that if my father saw fear, he might feel more powerful. If I challenged him too aggressively, he might react. So I spoke as if this could still be solved through words. I gave him a path to stop. Put the iron down. Do not make this worse. The police are coming. You can still stop. Maybe hearing his daughter's voice reached some part of him that was not completely lost in rage. Maybe he suddenly saw what he was doing. Maybe he only became afraid of the consequences. I do not know. The reason matters less than the result. He lowered his arm. The iron was placed down. My mother got away from him. The police arrived. The immediate danger ended. But years later, the the bottle still exists in my mind. There was something heartbreaking about its size. It was not even a regular cleaning spray bottle that could be held out like a barrier. It was a tiny travel bottle, the kind you might fill with water to mist your face. It was so small that it showed how quickly the attack happened. My mother had no chance to search for anything better. She grabbed the nearest object because she had only seconds. Every time I see one, I imagine that moment before I entered. I imagine her alone with him. I imagine her looking around the laundry room. I imagine her hand closing around the bottle. Maybe she thought, this is all I have. Then she used it anyway. That is why the bottle makes me think of both terror and bravery. Courage is not always standing tall with something powerful in your hand. Sometimes it is being trapped, terrified, and still refusing to stop defending yourself. Sometimes it is a child calling the police even though fear takes away her voice. Sometimes it is a 16-year-old walking into a room and trying to calm an armed adult. None of us felt brave. We were only trying to survive the next minute. I do not know whether I will ever see those little bottles as ordinary again. To everyone else, they are cheap pieces of plastic. People use them for travel, cleaning, hair products, or water. To me, they are connected to the worst fear I saw on my mother's face. They remind me how close our family came to something irreversible. They remind me that my mother reached for whatever she could find. They remind me that she was still fighting. When I think of that day, I do not first remember the police cars or the shouting. I remember walking into the kitchen. I remember the iron raised above my mother. I remember stepping between them and wondering whether my father would listen. Then I see her hand. Inside it is a tiny water bottle, almost useless against the weapon over her head. It was all she had, and she still tried to protect herself with it. About 2 years before I finally decided to share this story, back in December of 2016, something happened that started off as a strange little mystery and slowly turned into one of the most unsettling, ongoing experiences of my life. It all began the day I received a package in the mail, one that had no return address listed anywhere on it. Just my own name and address printed clearly on the front, giving me absolutely no indication of who might have sent it or where it had actually come from. When I opened the package, I found a doll inside, carefully and neatly wrapped, clearly packaged with a level of care that suggested whoever sent it had put real thought and effort into how it was presented. The doll itself was an old bride doll, the kind designed to look like a miniature bride in a wedding dress. What made this particular doll stand out immediately was a small mechanism built into its base. When activated, the doll would spin slowly while playing a tune, and there was something distinctly eerie about the sound it produced. A quality that felt slightly off compared to what you might expect from a typical musical toy or decorative item. The doll had an old, slightly musty smell to it, the kind of smell you would expect from something that had been sitting untouched in storage for a long time, but beyond that particular scent, it appeared to be in generally good condition overall. Along with the doll, there was a single handwritten note tucked into the package, containing just one short, strange instruction. It said simply, "Put her near a candle." There was no explanation attached to that instruction, no further context, no signature, nothing else to indicate who had written it or why they wanted the doll placed near a lit candle specifically. The only clue I had regarding where this package had actually come from was a shipping label indicating it had been sent from somewhere in Utah. This detail meant very little to me at the time, since I did not have any family living in Utah, nor did I know of any friends or acquaintances who might have a reason to send me something from that particular state. Given the complete lack of any obvious explanation, I initially assumed there had simply been some kind of mistake, that the package had been intended for someone else entirely, and had somehow ended up delivered to my address by error instead. Despite my confusion about where it had come from, I decided to go ahead and take the doll out of its packaging anyway, placing it on a table in my living room, mostly out of curiosity rather than any specific plan or reasoning behind the decision. About a week passed without anything else happening, and then another package arrived, again with no return address, again containing another doll inside. This second doll was made of porcelain, and notably, half of its face was missing entirely, leaving an unsettling, partially destroyed appearance to it. Despite the doll's damaged condition, whoever had packaged it had still taken the time to wrap it very nicely and delicately, treating it with a level of care that felt strangely at odds with how broken and unsettling the doll itself actually looked. Along with this second doll came another single handwritten note, this one reading, "She does not like children." Just like with the first package, I did not think too much about this second delivery at the time, choosing not to dwell on it extensively. Instead, I put this porcelain doll back into its box and placed it inside a closet, out of the way, rather than displaying it openly the way I had with the first doll. Another week passed, and sure enough, a third package arrived, following the same now familiar pattern. Inside was yet another doll, also made of porcelain, this one positioned on a display stand. This particular doll had a distinct smoke smell to it, though notably not the kind of smell you would associate with cigarette smoke specifically. It was a different kind of smoke odor entirely, something heavier and more suggestive of an actual fire having occurred near or around the doll at some point in its history. Just like the previous two dolls, this one had also been wrapped with the same careful, delicate attention to presentation. And once again, there was a single note included with the package. This one reading, "She died in a fire." At this point, receiving 3 separate dolls over the course of 3 consecutive weeks, with no explanation for who was sending them or why, I began to feel genuinely unnerved by the entire situation. I left this third doll inside its box as well, and placed it in the closet alongside the second one, choosing not to display it anywhere in my living space. I started asking around, reaching out to friends and family members to see if anyone might know anything about where these packages were coming from, whether anyone I knew had decided to send these dolls as some kind of unusual gift or prank. Nobody I spoke to had any information or knowledge about it whatsoever. I even went so far as to visit my local United States Postal Service office directly, hoping they might be able to provide some additional information about the sender based on the shipping details available to them. Unfortunately, that effort turned up nothing useful either. There simply was no clear information available anywhere that could help me identify who was responsible for sending these dolls to my home. Then, 3 days before Christmas that year, I came home fairly late in the evening, and as I walked into my living room, I noticed something that immediately sent a wave of unease through me. The bride doll, the very first doll I had received and had placed out on display on my living room table, had moved. When I had left the house earlier that day, she had been facing one specific direction. And now, upon my return, she was facing a completely different direction entirely. I remember experiencing an overwhelming, deeply unsettling feeling in that moment, the kind of feeling that is genuinely difficult to put into words, but immediately unmistakable once it hits you. I consider myself an atheist, and someone who tends to be fairly skeptical about most things, generally not inclined to jump to supernatural explanations for strange occurrences. But in that specific moment, standing there looking at that doll facing a completely different direction than I remembered leaving it, I found myself legitimately freaking out, unable to easily rationalize away what I was seeing. I immediately called my boyfriend, hoping he might have a simple explanation for what had happened. asking him directly if he had come home at some point that day and possibly moved the doll himself, whether intentionally or accidentally. He told me clearly that he had not stopped by the house at all that day, which meant there was no obvious, mundane explanation available for why that doll had ended up facing a different direction than where I had originally placed it. Unsettled and unwilling to leave it out any longer, I picked up the bride doll, placed her into a box, and put her away in the closet alongside the other two dolls, wanting her out of open sight after what had just happened. Over the course of the following month after that unsettling incident with the moved doll, the pattern of receiving packages continued steadily. I would receive another doll in the mail roughly once a week, each one accompanied by its own small, strange, unsettling note, similar in tone and style to the notes that had come with the earlier dolls. Each note carried its own specific, cryptic little detail, adding another small piece to whatever larger, unexplained story seemed to be unfolding through this ongoing series of deliveries. Then, just as suddenly and unexpectedly as it had all started, the packages simply stopped arriving altogether, with no final explanation, no concluding note, nothing to indicate why the deliveries had ended or who had been responsible for sending them in the first place. Once the packages finally stopped, I was left trying to figure out what exactly I should do with this growing collection of unsettling dolls that had accumulated in my home over the course of that strange month and a half. I did not feel particularly comfortable simply throwing them away, though I also had no interest in displaying any of them openly around my living space, especially after what had happened with the bride doll moving on her own. In the end, I made the decision to simply keep all of them, storing every single doll away together inside my closet, tucked out of sight, but not disposed of entirely. To this day, I still have no definitive answers regarding who sent me those dolls, or why they chose to target my address specifically with this strange, ongoing series of deliveries. I never received any further explanation, never got any kind of follow-up message or contact from whoever had been responsible for sending them, and the entire situation remains just as much of a mystery to me now as it was back when it was actually happening. What I can say with complete certainty, though, is that living through that entire experience, watching these unsettling dolls arrive one after another, each with their own strange note attached, culminating in that deeply unnerving moment of finding the bride doll facing a different direction with no logical explanation for how that could have happened, was an incredibly creepy, unsettling stretch of my life. One that has stuck with me vividly ever since. I have thought about the entire situation extensively in the time since it happened, trying to piece together any kind of coherent explanation that might make sense of everything. The notes themselves, when considered together, seem to suggest some kind of underlying narrative or backstory tied to each individual doll, almost as though whoever was sending them wanted me to understand something specific about each doll's supposed history or personality. The bride doll, with its instruction to be placed near a candle. The porcelain doll with half its face missing, described as not liking children, and the doll smelling faintly of smoke, described as having died in a fire, each carried its own small, specific detail that felt deliberately chosen rather than random or arbitrary. Whether these notes were meant to be taken literally, as though each doll genuinely carried some kind of specific spiritual history or presence tied to those described details, or whether they were simply part of some elaborate, unexplained prank designed to unsettle me over an extended period of time, I honestly cannot say with any confidence. What I do know is that the timing, the consistency, the careful presentation of each doll, and especially that specific incident involving the bride doll appearing to have moved on its own, all combined to create an experience that felt far more significant and unsettling than a simple, one-off prank typically would. I have kept all of these dolls together in my closet ever since that final package arrived. unable to bring myself to either display them openly around my home or dispose of them entirely. There is something about the entire situation that makes we want to hold on to them, almost as though getting rid of them might somehow be the wrong choice, even though I cannot fully articulate why that feeling persists so strongly. Whenever I happen to open that closet and catch sight of that collection of dolls sitting there together, I am immediately reminded of that entire strange stretch of weeks leading up to Christmas that year. The mysterious packages, the cryptic notes, and especially that specific late night when I came home to find the bride doll facing a direction she had absolutely no logical reason to be facing. I have shared photographs of the dolls with a few people who have expressed curiosity about what they actually look like, wanting some kind of visual confirmation of the story beyond simply hearing it described in words. Seeing the dolls themselves, particularly the porcelain one with half its face missing, tends to add another layer of unsettling realism to the story for anyone hearing about it for the first time, making it clear that this was not simply an exaggerated tale, but something rooted in actual physical objects that I still have in my possession to this day. Even now, years removed from when all of this actually happened, I still do not have any solid answers regarding who was responsible for sending those dolls or what their actual motivation might have been. It remains one of the strangest, most genuinely unsettling experiences of my entire life, made all the more unnerving by the complete lack of resolution or explanation surrounding any part of it. The packages simply stopped arriving one day, as mysteriously as they had started, leaving me with nothing but a closet full of old, strange dolls and a story that I still find myself returning to and thinking about whenever the topic of unexplainable, creepy experiences happens to come up. Back in the early 2000s, my family and I returned from a wonderful trip to Hawaii. We landed at Los Angeles International Airport tired, but happy, still carrying that relaxed feeling you get after a good vacation. The trip had been almost perfect. We had spent days near beautiful beaches, warm water, and places that felt completely different from home. Even the flight back had been peaceful. We were exhausted from traveling, but we were also talking about the trip and the things we had enjoyed most. Our original plan was to go directly home and have dinner there. We had luggage, important travel documents, and everything else a family would normally carry after returning from a trip. We were ready to finish the drive, unpack, and sleep in our own beds. But my father has type 1 diabetes. Not long after we left the airport, his blood sugar began dropping. A low blood sugar episode can become dangerous very quickly. He needed to eat something, and waiting until we reached home was not a good idea. When his blood sugar became low, he could become weak, confused, shaky, or unable to think clearly. We all understood that food was no longer optional. We needed to stop somewhere immediately. We looked for a restaurant near the airport and found a Denny's around Manchester Boulevard. Normally, stopping at a familiar chain restaurant would not have concerned us. Denny's was the kind of place where we knew there would be something my father could eat quickly. It was open, easy to find, and close enough that we would not have to continue driving while he felt unwell. The surrounding neighborhood did not look especially welcoming. The buildings appeared old and poorly maintained. Some businesses had metal bars covering their windows, storefronts looked worn down, and the streets had a rough feeling that made us more aware of our surroundings. It was not the kind of area where we would have chosen to spend time if we had not needed food quickly. Still, there were several people inside the restaurant, and it was a public place. We told ourselves we would eat, help my father get his blood sugar under control, and leave. We parked and carried the most important items inside with us. Because we had just returned from another country, we had our green cards and several other valuable documents. These were not things we normally carried around every day. We had identification, travel papers, money, and probably other personal items that would have been difficult and expensive to replace. Losing a wallet would have been bad enough. Losing our immigration documents and identification could have created serious problems for the entire family. At the time, however, we were thinking mostly about my father. We entered the restaurant and were seated in a booth near one of the corners. The location of the booth did not seem important when we sat down. In fact, it may have felt slightly inconvenient because we were farther from the entrance and the front counter. Later, that corner booth became one of the reasons we avoided being robbed. The restaurant looked like many other older diners. The lighting was bright, but not warm. The tables and booths had been used by thousands of customers. The air smelled like coffee, fried food, syrup, and cleaning chemicals. There were several families eating. An elderly woman was seated somewhere closer to the front. Other customers talked quietly, while employees moved between tables. Nothing seemed unusual. We ordered food and waited. My father needed something with sugar and carbohydrates as quickly as possible, so we watched him carefully. He may have had a drink or something small while waiting for the meal. The rest of us were tired from the flight. We were probably discussing our luggage, the drive home, and how soon we could finally rest. Then, my mother noticed 3 men outside. They were moving quickly toward the restaurant. At first, she did not know exactly what was wrong. People hurry toward buildings all the time, especially if they are crossing a parking lot or trying to get out of the cold. But these men were approaching together, and as they came closer, they began pulling up their hoods. My mother watched them for a moment. Something about the movement made her uncomfortable. It did not look casual. They seemed as though they were trying to hide their faces before entering. She did not want to frighten everyone or create a panic based only on a feeling, so she quietly mentioned it to us. She may have said something like, "Those men look strange," or told us to look toward the entrance. Before we could react, the door flew open. The men stormed inside with guns drawn. Everything changed instantly. 1 second, we were a tired family waiting for dinner. The next, armed men were shouting and taking control of the restaurant. It happened so quickly that there was no time to understand what was happening before the danger was already inside. The men ordered people not to move. Their voices were loud and aggressive. Customers froze. Employees stopped where they were. Some people raised their hands or lowered their heads. The robbers moved with urgency, pointing their weapons at anyone who might resist. They first went toward the cashier. They demanded money from the register. The employee behind the counter had no choice but to cooperate. No amount of money in a restaurant was worth being shot over. The cash drawer opened, and the men began taking what they could. From our corner booth, we watched helplessly. There was nowhere to run. The restaurant had windows, but many of them were protected by metal bars. Even if we had wanted to escape, moving suddenly would have drawn attention. The entrance was controlled by the robbers. We were trapped. One of the armed men began moving toward the customers. They were not satisfied with the money from the restaurant. They started robbing the people inside as well. They demanded wallets, purses, jewelry, and anything else that appeared valuable. Every table they reached became silent. People handed over their belongings because the guns were real and close. An elderly woman resisted. I do not know whether she did not understand what they wanted, whether she was frightened and reacted automatically, or whether she simply refused to surrender her property. Whatever the reason, one of the robbers struck her with the gun. He pistol whipped her. The sight made the entire situation more frightening. Until then, part of me may have hoped the men only wanted money and would leave without hurting anyone. Watching them attack an older woman destroyed that hope. They were willing to use violence. They did not care who they injured. If someone hesitated, argued, or moved the wrong way, they might attack again. The elderly woman was hurt simply for trying to protect what belonged to her. No one else wanted to risk the same treatment. The robbers moved to another family. They demanded everything valuable. Then they moved to another table and did the same thing. Each time they finished with one group, they came closer to us. I could see the path they were taking. They were working their way through the restaurant, table by table. Our booth was in the corner, so we were not among the first customers they reached. That gave us a little more time, but it also meant we had to sit and watch them approach. Waiting was terrible. I looked at the documents and belongings we had with us. I thought about the green cards. If the robbers took our wallets, bags, and travel papers, we would lose much more than money. We might have trouble proving our legal status. We could spend weeks or months replacing everything. There would be forms, appointments, fees, and uncertainty. But none of that mattered as much as staying alive. If the men reached us, we would give them whatever they demanded. I looked at my family. My father was already dealing with low blood sugar. Stress could make his condition worse. He might become confused or move more slowly than the robbers expected. I worried they would misunderstand his behavior. If he failed to respond quickly, they might believe he was resisting. I wanted to explain that he was diabetic, but speaking without permission could have been dangerous. We remained as still as possible. The restaurant felt strangely quiet beneath the shouting. I could hear frightened breathing, small movements, and the robbers' shoes against the floor. No one knew whether the men would shoot. No one knew whether the police had already been called. Even if someone had activated an alarm, the robbers might finish before officers arrived. I remember thinking that the whole thing looked like a scene from a movie. Masked men with guns, customers frozen in booths, a cashier emptying a register, a frightened family waiting in a corner. But in a movie, the audience knows it is not real. The actors are safe. The weapons are props. No one sitting in the restaurant had that comfort. Every gunshot we imagined could actually happen. The robbers finished taking property from the second family and continued toward us. There was only one occupied table between them and our booth. The people at that table had been quiet throughout the robbery. As the armed men approached them, something changed. The customers at the table did not react like the others. They did not immediately reach for wallets or lower their eyes. Instead, they stared directly at the robbers. It was not a frightened glance. It was a cold, steady look. The people at that table looked at the armed men as if they were beneath them. There was anger and confidence in their expressions. They did not appear impressed by the guns. They looked at the robbers like they were complete trash. From where we sat, the moment felt unreal. The robbers had already attacked an elderly woman. They had taken money from the cashier and robbed 2 families. They had shown no hesitation. We expected them to point their guns at the next table and demand everything. Instead, they stopped. The 2 groups stared at one another. For a moment, no one spoke. It felt like a standoff. The customers did not move. The robbers did not move closer. Something passed between them that the rest of us did not understand. Maybe there was recognition. Maybe there was a warning hidden in the way the people at the table looked at them. Maybe the robbers noticed something we could not see. Their posture changed. The confidence they had shown while terrorizing the restaurant suddenly disappeared. They backed away. They did not rob that table. They did not continue toward us. They turned and hurried out of the restaurant. The men who had entered shouting and waving guns now rushed toward the door as though they were the ones in danger. Within seconds, they were gone. For a moment, no one inside moved. The restaurant remained frozen. We did not know if the robbers had truly left. They might have been waiting outside. They might return. There could have been another person watching the entrance. The sudden silence after so much shouting was almost as frightening as the robbery itself. Then, people began reacting. Someone checked on the elderly woman. The cashier moved away from the register. Families looked at one another and counted their belongings. Some people began crying. Others talked at once, describing what they had seen. Someone called the police, if they had not already been contacted. My family remained in the booth, stunned. We still had our possessions. Our green cards and documents had not been taken. The robbers had come within one table of reaching us, then turned around and fled. We had no idea why. I kept looking at the people seated in front of us. They were the reason the robbers had stopped. There was no other clear explanation. But what had the thieves seen? The people at the table had not shouted. They had not openly displayed weapons, at least not where we could see. They had only stared. Yet that look had been enough to make 3 armed criminals abandon the robbery and escape. I developed 2 possible explanations. The first was that the people at the table recognized the robbers. Maybe they knew their names, families, or neighborhood. Perhaps the armed men understood that these witnesses could identify them immediately. Robbers often hide their faces to prevent anyone from describing them to police. If the people at the table already knew who they were, then the hoods no longer mattered. The criminals might have realized that continuing would guarantee they were caught. Maybe the silent message was simple. We know exactly who you are. That could have frightened them enough to leave. The second possibility was that the people at the table were armed too. Perhaps one of them had a gun under the table or inside a jacket. Maybe the robbers noticed a hand moving toward a weapon. The rest of us may not have seen it because of the angle. If the customers were armed and prepared to fight, the thieves would suddenly face a very different situation. They had been in control while everyone else was unarmed and afraid. A gunfight inside a crowded restaurant could easily kill them. Maybe the robbers decided that the money they had taken was not worth the risk. There were other possibilities, too. The people at the table might have been police officers who were off duty. They could have been connected to another dangerous group. Perhaps one of them had a reputation the robbers recognized. Maybe they knew each other from somewhere else. I never learned the truth. The customers did not explain what had happened to us. They may have spoken to the police, but we were not included in that conversation. From my perspective, they simply stared the robbers down and made them leave. It felt like something from a crime film. The criminals entered with weapons and controlled the room. Then they met the eyes of people who were not afraid of them. Suddenly, the power changed. The robbers understood something the rest of us did not, and they ran. Police arrived after the men had escaped. Officers took statements from employees and customers. They asked what the robbers looked like, what they were wearing, how many guns we saw, and which direction they went. Everyone tried to remember details. Fear makes memory unreliable. Some people remembered clothing clearly, but not faces. Others could describe one man's height, but not the others. The hoods had hidden much of their appearance. The cashier had probably seen them from the closest distance. The elderly woman had been injured and needed attention. My family explained where we had been sitting and how the robbers had stopped at the table before ours. I do not know whether the police found that detail as strange as we did. Maybe the people at that table gave them a private explanation. Maybe the officers already knew who they were. No one told us. My father eventually received the food or sugar he needed. The reason we had entered the restaurant in the first place had almost been forgotten during the robbery, but his blood sugar still required attention. That made the situation feel even more unreal. Only a short time earlier, our biggest concern had been finding food quickly enough for a medical problem. Then, armed men stormed the building. After they left, we still had to return to the ordinary task of helping my father eat. Our bodies were full of fear, but his diabetes did not pause because something traumatic had happened. We needed to make sure he was stable before leaving. I remember looking around the restaurant afterward. The room appeared almost normal. The tables were still there. The lights remained bright. Food sat unfinished on plates. Coffee cups had been abandoned, yet the atmosphere had completely changed. The entrance, where the men had kicked their way inside, no longer looked like an ordinary door. The front counter had become the place where guns were first pointed. The aisle between the booths was now the route the robbers had taken, while moving from family to family. The elderly woman's table marked the place where the violence became physical, and the booth in front of ours remained the place where the robbery suddenly ended. We left as soon as we could. The drive home was much quieter than we had expected after returning from Hawaii. We should have been talking about the vacation. Instead, we kept discussing the men. Why did they stop? Who were the people at the other table? What would have happened if the robbers had continued? We thought about the documents we still had. Had the robbery lasted only another minute, we might have lost them. More importantly, one of us might have been injured. My father's condition made me wonder how he would have reacted if they reached us. If his blood sugar dropped further, he could have appeared confused or uncooperative. A robber who had already struck an elderly woman might not have shown patience. The corner booth had delayed their approach. The other table had stopped it completely. Those small details protected us. If we had been seated closer to the door, we would almost certainly have been robbed. If the restaurant had assigned us another booth, the men might have reached us before they met the people who frightened them away. If my father's blood sugar had not dropped, we would never have entered the restaurant at all. The entire event came from a chain of small decisions and circumstances. Our flight landed. We began driving home. My father needed food. We chose that Denny's. We sat in that corner. 3 men arrived. One table refused to look afraid. Sometimes I think about how close an ordinary medical stop came to becoming a tragedy. The robbers were willing to use violence. The elderly woman's injury proved that. If someone had tried to be a hero, the men might have fired. If police arrived while they were still inside, there could have been a shootout. If the mysterious customers were truly armed, they might have decided to draw their weapons rather than stare. The restaurant was full of families. Any bullet could have struck the wrong person. The fact that no one was killed was incredibly fortunate. I still wonder whether the police ever caught the robbers. At the time, we hoped they would be arrested quickly. They had attacked an elderly woman, terrorized several families, and stolen from people who were only trying to eat. But I never heard a final result. Maybe security cameras captured them. Maybe the people at the mysterious table identified them. Maybe someone recognized the vehicle they used. Or perhaps they escaped and committed similar crimes somewhere else. That possibility bothered me. People willing to enter a crowded restaurant with guns were unlikely to stop after one robbery. I especially hoped they were caught because of the old woman they attacked. She was one of the most vulnerable people in the room, and they hurt her simply because she resisted. There was nothing brave or impressive about what they did. They used weapons and numbers to frighten people who had no way to defend themselves. Then, when they reached someone who did not seem afraid, they ran. That detail stayed with me. Their confidence had depended entirely on everyone else feeling helpless. The moment they believed they might face consequences, they left. Years have passed since that night, but I can still picture the scene. I see the 3 men approaching the restaurant while pulling up their hoods. I hear my mother quietly warning us. I see the door being forced open. I remember the guns. I remember the elderly woman being struck. I remember watching the robbers move closer to our booth. Most clearly, I remember the table directly in front of us. The people sitting there did not lower their eyes. They did not reach for their wallets. They stared at the men with a level of confidence that made no sense to me at the time. The robbers stopped. For a few seconds, the entire room seemed to wait. Then, the armed men backed away and ran. I may never know whether those customers recognized them, whether they were carrying weapons, or whether there was another explanation. Whatever happened, it saved my family from being robbed, and may have prevented further violence. We entered that restaurant because my father's blood sugar was dangerously low. We expected nothing more than a quick meal before driving home. Instead, we found ourselves trapped in a corner while armed men robbed the people around us. The situation came within one table of reaching us. Then, without any explanation, it ended. The criminals ran. The mysterious customers remained, and my family walked out with our lives, our documents, and a question I still cannot answer. A while ago, I took 3 friends to a cemetery near our area that people claimed was haunted. None of us truly believed every story we had heard about it, but it had a reputation for being creepy, especially at night. People said strange things happened there, that figures had been seen between the graves, and that drivers sometimes heard sounds coming from the woods around the property. Most of those stories were probably exaggerated. Still, visiting a supposedly haunted cemetery in the middle of the night sounded like a fun idea. All 4 of us worked the same late shift, and we got off work at around 4:30 in the morning. Instead of going home, we decided to drive straight to the cemetery. It felt like the perfect time for it. The sun had not yet risen, the roads were almost empty, and there was a thick layer of fog covering the entire area. It was not light mist either. The fog was so heavy that I could barely see 30 feet in front of the car. Streetlights appeared as dull circles in the distance, then disappeared behind us. Trees along the road looked like tall black shapes standing inside clouds. Even familiar places seemed strange. The 4 of us were tired from work, but the excitement kept us awake. We joked about ghosts and tried to scare one another as we drove. Someone said we would probably see a woman in white standing beside the graves. Another friend said the car would refuse to start once we reached the cemetery. I laughed, but I kept looking through the windshield more carefully than usual. The fog made every shadow look like something moving. The cemetery was located far away from the busier parts of town. To reach it, we had to turn onto a narrow gravel road that cut through thick woods. The entrance looked creepy even during the day. At 5 in the morning, surrounded by fog, it looked like the beginning of a horror movie. There were no nearby houses. There were no businesses or streetlights. Once we left the paved road, the only light came from my headlights and fog lights. The gravel path stretched ahead of us between the trees. It was about 2 miles long. That distance did not seem very far when we talked about the trip earlier, but driving it in those conditions felt completely different. The tires crushed loose stones beneath us. Branches hung close to the sides of the road, and the fog reflected the light back toward the windshield. The deeper we drove into the woods, the more isolated we felt. The road was too narrow to turn around easily in most places. Trees stood close on both sides, and the ground beyond the gravel looked muddy and uneven. If the car stopped working, we would have been stuck almost 2 miles inside the forest before sunrise. No one joked about that possibility. At first, we continued talking loudly, but our voices slowly became quieter. The woods seemed to absorb sound. Outside the windows, there was only darkness, fog, and the occasional tree appearing suddenly in the headlights. My friends began admitting that the road itself was more frightening than the cemetery. One of them said it felt like someone could be standing among the trees, watching the car pass. I told him to stop saying things like that, but I also looked toward the woods. I could not see more than a few feet beyond the road. Anything could have been out there. We continued slowly. Every turn looked the same. For a moment, I wondered whether we had passed the cemetery without seeing it. The fog was so thick that a sign or gate could easily disappear into the darkness. Then the road opened slightly. We had reached the end. The cemetery entrance was directly ahead. Unfortunately, the gate was closed. A sign explained that the area was inaccessible because of flooding. Apparently, heavy rain had made parts of the cemetery and surrounding road unsafe. We sat there in disappointment. After driving through 2 miles of dark woods at the perfect creepy hour, we could not even enter. We looked through the gate, but the fog covered most of the property. We could see only a short section of the road and a few vague shapes that may have been gravestones. No one wanted to climb over the gate. Even if we ignored the warning, the ground could have been dangerously flooded or soft. We agreed that going inside would be stupid. For a few minutes, we remained parked near the entrance. Someone suggested taking pictures through the gate, but the fog made them almost useless. The flash reflected back and created a bright white blur. Another friend said maybe the cemetery had closed itself because it did not want visitors. We laughed, though the joke sounded less funny in that place. Eventually, I turned the car around. The return trip along the gravel road felt slightly easier because we knew where we were going. Still, the woods remained eerie. My friends kept looking through the rear window toward the cemetery. One of them said he expected to see a person following the car. I checked the mirror more than once. There was nothing behind us except fog and the faint marks our tires had left on the wet gravel. After what felt like much longer than 2 miles, we reached the paved road again. I turned left, heading back in the direction of our workplace. The clock was close to 5 in the morning. There were still no signs of sunrise. The sky had become slightly lighter, but the fog made everything look dark and gray. I kept the fog lights on. Even with them, I could only see a short distance in front of the car. The 4 of us had become quiet. The cemetery trip had been disappointing, and we were tired. We were probably all thinking about getting home and sleeping. Then, my friend in the passenger seat leaned forward. "Hey," he said, "what the hell is that?" His voice broke the silence so suddenly that everyone looked up. At first, I saw nothing. Then a shape appeared at the edge of the headlights. Someone was walking along the side of the road. The person was moving in the same direction we were driving, with their back partly turned toward us. That was strange enough by itself. It was around 5 in the morning. We were in a remote area surrounded by woods. The fog was so thick that walking near the road was dangerous. The person did not appear to be carrying a light. We could not see where they had come from or where they were going. The figure wore dark clothing and moved steadily along the shoulder. No car was parked nearby. There were no houses within sight. The timing of the encounter made everyone uncomfortable. We had just come from a supposedly haunted cemetery, and now a lone person had appeared through the fog in the middle of nowhere. One of my friends asked if we should stop and see whether the person needed help. The others immediately said no. The person might have been lost or stranded, but none of us wanted to take that chance. I moved the car toward the opposite side of the road to give them as much space as possible. There was no traffic coming from the other direction, so I crossed partly over the center line. As we approached, the person did not wave. They did not turn toward us or ask for help. They simply continued walking. For a second, the headlights showed part of their body more clearly, but the fog and darkness hid most details. I could not tell if it was a man or woman. The person's clothing looked loose and heavy. Then we passed. Everyone turned to look through the windows and mirrors. The figure disappeared behind the car almost immediately, swallowed by the fog. My friend in the back seat asked whether anyone had seen the person's face. No one had. We drove forward for only a few seconds. Then I stopped the car. I do not know exactly why I stopped. Maybe I wanted to make sure the person was not following us. Maybe something ahead caught my eye. Perhaps my brain noticed shapes in the fog before I consciously understood them. The car came to a complete stop in the middle of the road. Everyone looked forward. At first, the fog seemed empty. Then, more figures began appearing. One person, then another, then several more. As my eyes adjusted, I realized there were people all across the road, not 5 or 10. There appeared to be more than 50 of them. They were walking toward us through the fog. Some were on the shoulder. Others were directly in the road. They were spread across both lanes, almost like a human barricade. For one terrible second, no one in the car spoke. The headlights illuminated the closest figures, but many more shapes moved behind them. Their bodies appeared and disappeared in the thick white air. They walked together in a large group. Because of the darkness and distance, I could not see their faces. I only saw silhouettes. My mind immediately created the worst possible explanation. We had just visited a haunted cemetery. We had passed the lone person on an empty road. Now a crowd of more than 50 figures was advancing toward us through the fog. It looked completely unnatural. People do not normally gather in the middle of a remote road at 5 in the morning. They certainly do not spread across both lanes without lights or visible vehicles. For a moment, it seemed as though the first person had been part of the group. Maybe we had driven into some strange gathering. Maybe they were blocking the road intentionally. My friends began speaking at once. What the hell is this? Why are they in the road? Turn around. I had watched enough horror movies to know exactly how a scene like that usually ended. A group blocks the car. The driver stops. People surround the vehicle. The doors are pulled open. The characters disappear. Those images entered my head immediately. I did not want to wait and discover whether the crowd was friendly. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. I looked into the rearview mirror. The lone figure we had passed was somewhere behind us in the fog. The gravel road leading back to the cemetery was not far away. I decided to reverse. There was no safe space to turn around quickly, and I did not want to drive closer to the crowd. I shifted the car into reverse. My friends held onto their seats. I was about to press the accelerator when my friend in the passenger seat suddenly relaxed. He let out a long breath. The change in him confused me. A second earlier, he had looked just as frightened as the rest of us. Now he sounded relieved. I looked at him. "Why are you so calm?" I asked. He pointed through the windshield. "That's an army uniform." I looked again. The people were closer now. The fog shifted slightly, and the headlights showed more detail. He was right. They were soldiers. The lone person we had passed had also been part of the group. The large crowd was not a collection of ghosts, criminals, or strange people blocking the road. It was a military training unit, conducting an early morning patrol. There was a training facility somewhere in the area, and the soldiers were moving along the road as part of an exercise. They wore uniforms. They carried large packs on their backs. Several had rifles in their hands. From far away, with the fog hiding their clothing and equipment, all we had seen were dark human shapes. Once we understood what they were, the entire scene changed. The same group that had looked like a terrifying human barricade suddenly looked organized and completely normal. They were walking in formation, though the fog had made them appear scattered. The packs changed the shape of their bodies. The rifles had blended into the darkness. Their uniforms were designed to be difficult to see, which worked extremely well in the early morning fog. The person we had passed was probably the last member of the patrol or someone walking slightly behind the rest. We had unknowingly driven between that soldier and the main group. My fear turned into immediate embarrassment and relief. I shifted the car out of reverse. Everyone began laughing. It was not relaxed laughter at first. It was the kind that comes after the body is prepared for danger and then discovers there is none. The soldiers continued toward us. I slowed the car and moved carefully to give them room. Up close, they were clearly members of the military. Their uniforms were visible. They carried equipment and moved with the tired but steady pace of people completing a long exercise. Some looked toward our car as we passed. I wondered what they thought of us. Maybe they had seen the car stop suddenly and begin reversing. Maybe they understood that the fog had frightened us. Perhaps this happened often in that area. A group of soldiers walking before sunrise could easily surprise drivers who did not know about the nearby training facility. We passed them slowly. There seemed to be even more people than we first believed. They filled the road behind us, disappearing into the fog as we continued. Once the last soldier was out of sight, everyone in the car began talking loudly. Each person described what they had imagined. One friend thought it was some kind of cult. Another thought the people might be protesters or criminals intentionally blocking the road. Someone else admitted that, for a few seconds, he had wondered whether they were dead people coming from the cemetery. I said nothing about the exact horror movie scene that had played inside my head. I had been only a moment away from reversing as quickly as possible down a fog-covered road. That could have created a real emergency. Driving backward at high speed with limited visibility would have been extremely dangerous. We could have gone off the road, struck a tree, or hit the person walking behind us. The last possibility made me feel especially uncomfortable. The soldier we had already passed was somewhere behind the car. If I had reversed immediately, I might not have seen him in time. Fear had almost caused me to do something far more dangerous than simply waiting. That realization helped calm me. The soldiers had not threatened us. They probably had no idea how frightening they looked from a distance. The fog, darkness, cemetery, and timing had combined to make an ordinary military patrol appear supernatural. We continued toward work. The sky slowly grew lighter, though the fog remained thick. The roads closer to town were more familiar and better lit. Buildings appeared again. Gas stations, traffic lights, and signs made us feel as though we had returned to the normal world. We stopped talking about ghosts. Instead, we kept joking about how close I had come to fleeing from an army patrol. My friend in the passenger seat repeated the moment he recognized the uniform. At first, he had only seen the shape of the closest person. Then the headlights caught part of the clothing, the pack straps, and the rifle. He realized all at once what we were looking at. His relief spread through the car. By the time we reached our workplace, the fear had become a funny story. We parked and sat there for a few minutes, still laughing and discussing what had happened. Then everyone went their separate ways. The trip to the haunted cemetery had failed. We never reached the graves. We did not see a ghost. We did not hear strange voices in the woods. Nothing supernatural happened. Yet, the drive back frightened us more than the cemetery probably would have. The experience stayed with me because it showed how much the mind depends on context. If we had seen the soldiers in daylight, we would have recognized them immediately. If we had known there was a training facility nearby, the first person on the road would not have seemed strange. If we had not just driven 2 miles through dark woods toward a haunted cemetery, we probably would not have imagined something terrifying. But at 5 in the morning, surrounded by heavy fog, everything felt different. The first person became a mysterious figure. The patrol became a human barricade. The military packs made their bodies look larger and less natural. The rifles blended into the shadows. The fog removed all the small details that would have explained the scene. It left only shapes. And when the human brain sees shapes without explanations, it creates its own story. Ours was not a comforting one. For a brief moment, I genuinely believed we had driven into something terrible. I thought the people were waiting for us. I thought they might surround the car. I thought reversing was our only chance to escape. The truth was far simpler. There were tired soldiers performing an early morning patrol. They were probably thinking about finishing their training, getting breakfast, or returning to their facility. We were the strange people in a car stopped in the middle of their route. Even though the ending was harmless, I still remember the moment the figures began appearing through the fog. 1 became 5. 5 became 20. Then, I realized the entire road was filled with people walking toward us. It looked like a nightmare forming directly in front of the headlights. I also remember the strange silence inside the car. No one knew what to say. We were all waiting for someone else to explain what we were seeing. Then, I reached for the gear shift. My body had already decided to run before my mind had enough information. The only thing that stopped me was my friend recognizing the uniform. That night taught me 2 things. The first was that supposedly haunted places do not need ghosts to frighten you. Darkness, isolation, and imagination are often enough. The second was that panic can become dangerous very quickly. My attempt to escape could have injured someone. I was lucky my friend noticed the truth before I pressed the accelerator. We still talk about the trip occasionally. The others remember the creepy gravel road, the closed cemetery gate, and the lone figure walking beside the road. But the part everyone remembers best is the crowd. More than 50 shadowy people moving toward us through thick fog. At first, they appeared to be blocking every possible path. Then, one simple detail became visible: a uniform. In an instant, the horror scene disappeared. The human barricade became a military patrol. The strangers became soldiers. The rifles that might have made the scene more frightening became the detail that helped explain it. We had gone looking for ghosts and found the army instead. Nothing supernatural happened. But for several seconds on that fog-covered road, all 4 of us believed we had found something much worse. I do not think this experience affects me very much now, at least not in any obvious way. I can talk about it without becoming emotional, and most of the time it feels like something that happened to another person a long time ago. But when I think about the details, I realize how serious it was. My father was a very heavy alcoholic. He did not only drink at parties or on weekends. Alcohol was part of almost everything he did. He drove while drunk. He went to work drunk. He came home drunk. Most of my memories of him from that period involve trying to guess how much he had been drinking and what kind of mood he would be in. Sometimes he was quiet. Sometimes he was friendly and acted as though everything was normal. Other times he became angry over small things. The hardest part was never knowing which version of him would come through the door. When I was a child, I did not fully understand alcoholism. I knew my father drank too much, but I did not understand why he could not simply stop. I thought adults were supposed to be in control of themselves. My father was not. The alcohol changed the way he spoke, walked, and reacted. He could become unreasonable very quickly. A normal conversation could turn into shouting without warning. My family learned to watch him carefully. We noticed the sound of his car arriving. We listened to the way he opened the front door. We watched his eyes, his balance, and the way he placed his keys down. Within seconds, we could usually tell whether the evening was going to be peaceful or dangerous. One day, he came home decently drunk. I was only about 8 or 9 years old. My sister was around 14 or 15. I do not remember what time of day it was or what the rest of us had been doing before he arrived. Some parts of the memory are completely clear, while others have disappeared. What I remember is the feeling that something was wrong almost immediately. My father was aggressive from the moment he entered. There was no long argument leading up to it. There was no normal family conversation that slowly became angry. The tension came through the door with him. My sister greeted him when he arrived. She may have said hello or asked how he was. It was the kind of ordinary greeting a child gives a parent when they come home. He responded by putting his hands around her neck. At first, I did not understand what I was seeing. My mind did not immediately recognize it as an attack because this was my father and my sister. Parents were not supposed to do things like that to their children. But he was choking her. Maybe he was not using all his strength. Maybe in his drunken mind he thought he was only frightening or controlling her. It did not matter. His hands were around her throat, and she could not easily get away. My sister struggled. Her necklace caught between them. Then it broke. The sound of it snapping is one of the small details I still remember. The chain gave way, and somehow my sister managed to pull herself free. Everything became chaotic after that. There was shouting. My mother moved quickly. My sister was frightened and trying to get away from him. I was too young to understand what I should do, so I stayed close to my mother and sister. My father was a chef. Because of his work, he owned a good collection of knives. They were not cheap kitchen knives bought in a small set from a grocery store. They were professional tools, kept sharp because he used them for his job. Usually they were simply part of the kitchen. That day, they became the most frightening things in the house. I do not remember the exact moment he picked up a knife. The memory jumps from my sister escaping his hands to my father shouting and my mother moving us toward her bedroom. Maybe she saw him reach for the knives. Maybe he threatened us before she acted. Maybe she simply understood from his behavior that we needed to get behind a locked door immediately. She grabbed my sister and me and rushed us into her bedroom. Then she locked the door. Thankfully, my father did not have a key. The bedroom became the only safe place in the house. My mother, my sister, and I climbed onto the bed and held one another. I was crying. My sister was crying too. My mother may have been crying, but she was also trying to keep us quiet and calm. Outside the room, my father continued shouting. His voice sounded different through the door. The wood made the words less clear, but the anger came through perfectly. Then we heard the knife against the lock. He was trying to get inside. At first, he stabbed or cut around the doorknob. Metal scraped against metal. The blade struck the door. He tried to use the knife to pick the lock, forcing it into small spaces around the handle. When that did not work, he moved the knife to the side of the door and tried to damage the locking mechanism. Each sound made us believe the door was about to open. We sat together on the bed, listening. There was nowhere else to go. The bedroom may have had a window, but I was too young to think about climbing out. Even if there was a way to escape, my mother probably did not want to separate us or risk putting us outside where my father might reach us. Our only plan was to wait for the police. Someone had called them. I do not know whether it was my mother, my sister, or perhaps a neighbor who heard the shouting. We knew help was coming. We did not know if it would arrive in time. My father continued attacking the door. I remember looking at the doorknob and expecting it to move. Every time the knife scraped against it, I imagined the lock breaking. I thought he would come into the room holding the blade. I did not know what would happen after that. At 8 or 9 years old, I understood death, but not in the same way an adult does. I knew knives could kill people. I knew my father was angry and trying to reach us. That was enough. I believed he might kill my mother, my sister, and me. My sister had already escaped from his hands once. Maybe he was angrier because she got away. Maybe he believed we were all against him because we had locked the door. Alcohol had made him impossible to reason with. He was not standing outside asking us to come out and talk. He was using a professional kitchen knife to force his way into the room. The three of us held one another and waited. 20 minutes can pass quickly under normal circumstances. You can watch part of a television show, eat a meal, or scroll through your phone, and the time disappears. That night, 20 minutes felt endless. Every second carried the possibility that the door would break. I remember crying quietly because I did not want him to hear us more than he already could. My mother kept us close. She may have told us everything would be okay. Parents often say that even when they have no way to know if it is true. I wanted to believe her. But the knife kept hitting the door. My father shouted from the other side. I wondered why the police were taking so long. I did not understand distances, emergency response times, or how long it took for someone to explain an address over the phone. All I knew was that we needed them immediately. I imagined police cars racing toward the house. I listened for sirens. For a long time, I heard nothing except my father. He tried different ways to get through the door. He pushed at it. He worked the knife around the lock. He stabbed at the wood near the handle. He may have pulled and twisted the knob. The door held. Looking back, he probably could have broken it more easily if he had been sober enough to think clearly. He could have kicked near the lock. He might have used his shoulder. He could have found a heavier tool. But he was drunk and focused on using the knife. His lack of clear thinking may have saved us. At the time, I did not understand that. I thought the door was strong enough to protect us. Now I know that an ordinary bedroom door is not designed to stop a determined adult. It only delayed him because he was too intoxicated and confused to use a more effective method. That is a frightening thought. Our safety depended partly on the same alcohol that had made him violent. If he had been slightly less drunk, he might have reached us before the police arrived. The sounds outside the room changed. Sometimes the knife scraped rapidly. Other times, there was a pause. Those quiet moments were almost worse. When the noise stopped, we did not know what he was doing. Maybe he had gone to find another weapon. Maybe he was preparing to charge the door. Maybe he had left the house. We listened for footsteps. Then the attack on the lock would begin again. I remember feeling very small. The bed seemed like the farthest place from the door, but it was only a few steps away. If he entered, there was nothing between us and him. My mother could try to protect us, but she was unarmed. My sister was still a teenager. I was a child. He was an adult man with a knife. There was no fair fight. There was only the door and the time it bought us. I have tried to remember what my father was shouting. Most of the exact words are gone. Maybe my mind chose not to keep them. I remember the tone more than the sentences. He sounded furious. He believed he had the right to enter. He did not seem to care that his children were crying. He did not care that he had already attacked my sister. Whatever was happening inside his drunken mind mattered more to him than our fear. That may be one of the hardest things to accept. This was our father. He was supposed to protect us from someone trying to break into the bedroom with a knife. Instead, he was the person outside the door. At some point, we finally heard the police arrive. The sounds outside changed suddenly. There were new voices. Men shouted commands. My father yelled back. There was movement through the house. We stayed where we were. My mother did not open the bedroom door immediately. We did not know whether the officers had control of him. Then we heard a struggle. The police used force when they arrested him. From the sounds, it seemed violent. Later, I understood that they had beaten him badly while taking him into custody. At the time, I felt no sympathy. I only wanted them to stop him. I wanted the knife away from him. I wanted the house to become quiet. The officers eventually told us it was safe. The bedroom door opened. The area around the lock was damaged. There were marks where the knife had struck the wood and metal. Seeing the damage made everything feel more real. From the bed, I had imagined the blade moving around the other side. Now, I could see the physical proof of how hard he had tried to enter. My father was arrested. The police took him away. I do not remember whether he was still shouting as they removed him. I do not remember seeing him in handcuffs or watching the police car leave. My clearest memories end with the door, the knife, and the sounds of the officers controlling him. Afterward, the house was probably silent. But it was not peaceful. There is a difference. A peaceful house feels safe. A silent house after violence feels empty and damaged. The danger had left, but everything that had happened remained inside. My sister's broken necklace was still there. The damaged door was still there. The knives still belonged to my father. The memories did not disappear when the police drove away. I do not remember what explanation adults gave me afterward. Maybe my mother said my father was sick because of alcohol. Maybe someone told me he had not known what he was doing. Perhaps they said he loved us and would never behave that way sober. Those explanations may have helped the adults understand the situation. As a child, they were confusing. If he loved us, why had he attacked my sister? If he did not know what he was doing, why was he so determined to get through the door? If alcohol made him dangerous, why did he continue drinking? Children often believe adults have simple answers. That experience taught me that adults can be lost, damaged, and dangerous too. I also learned that a home is not automatically safe just because your family lives there. Before that day, danger was something I imagined outside. It was a stranger following someone, a burglar entering through a window, or a criminal hiding in the dark. Afterward, I understood that the person you fear can already have a key to the house. They can be your parent. They can be someone you love. They can be the person whose car you recognize in the driveway. That kind of fear changes the way a child listens. The sound of the front door opening becomes important. Footsteps in the hallway matter. The way someone puts down a bag or closes a cabinet can warn you about their mood. I may not feel affected now, but I probably learned habits from that time that became part of me. I notice changes in people's voices. I pay attention when someone who has been drinking becomes angry. I do not like being trapped in a room with a person who is losing control. I take threats seriously, even when others say the person is only drunk. Alcohol does not create every violent thought, but it can remove the control that keeps someone from acting on them. My father's drinking was not an excuse. It was part of the danger. For years, I was unsure whether he had truly intended to kill us. Maybe he only wanted to frighten us. Maybe he wanted to force the door open and continue shouting. Maybe the knife was only a tool he chose because he was too drunk to think of anything else. But I returned to the same facts. He had already placed his hands around my sister's throat. He picked up a sharp knife. He tried for about 20 minutes to enter a locked room where his wife and 2 children were hiding from him. He did not stop when he heard us crying. He only stopped when police physically removed him. I cannot know what he would have done if the lock had broken. That uncertainty is almost as frightening as a clear answer. Part of me believes he was trying to kill us. Maybe he did not have a detailed plan. Maybe there were no organized thoughts in his mind. But in that state, he was willing to do something that could easily have ended in death. Intent can become difficult to separate from action when someone is attacking a door with a knife. We were right to be afraid. My mother was right to lock us inside. The police were right to treat him as dangerous. I sometimes think about my sister's experience differently from my own. I watched my father attack her. She felt his hands around her neck. She had to fight free. Her necklace broke during the struggle. Then she had to sit beside me in the bedroom while the same man tried to reach us with a knife. She was only 14 or 15. That is still a child, even if she seemed older to me at the time. She may have believed the entire situation was her fault because the first attack focused on her. Maybe she wondered if she had said something wrong when she greeted him. There was nothing she could have said that justified what he did. A parent does not choke a child because of a greeting. A drunk adult's violence is never the child's responsibility. I also think about my mother. She had only seconds to react. She got both of us into the bedroom. She locked the door. She kept us together while her husband tried to enter. She had to listen to him attack the lock while pretending she could protect us. She may have believed she was about to die too. Still, she held us. That is what I remember. The three of us together, on the bed. We were afraid, but we were not alone. My father wanted to separate himself from us through violence. Instead, his actions pushed us closer together. I do not know what happened legally after the arrest. Maybe he spent a night in jail. Maybe there were charges, court appearances, or promises that he would stop drinking. Adults often hide those details from children. What I remember is that life eventually continued. The damaged door was repaired or replaced. The broken necklace disappeared. My father returned at some point. Families can return to ordinary routines after terrible things, especially when addiction and abuse are involved. Breakfast still has to be made. Children still go to school. Bills still need to be paid. The normal days can make the violent ones feel unreal. But the body remembers. Even if I say it does not affect me now, I can still place myself in that room. I can see the bed. I can feel my mother and sister holding me. I can hear the knife working around the lock. I can imagine the handle turning. I remember waiting for sirens. I remember believing the police might arrive 1 minute too late. That is not a normal childhood memory. It is a survival memory. No child should have to decide whether their father is trying to kill them. No child should hear a parent attacking a locked door and understand that the lock is the only protection between them and a knife. No child should feel relief when police beat and arrest their parent. But that was where we were. The officers used force because my father was violent and armed. They may have saved our lives. I do not celebrate what happened to him, but I cannot pretend I wanted them to be gentle while he was still trying to reach us. At that moment, I needed adults who were stronger than him to take control. They did. The story has no supernatural element. There was no monster hiding in the house. There was only a drunk father who became the monster his family needed protection from. That may be why the memory is so difficult to place. It does not fit neatly into how children want to see their parents. A father can cook meals, work, laugh, and still become dangerous. A person can love their family and still cause permanent harm. Addiction can explain behavior without excusing it. All of those truths can exist together. I am older now. I understand more about alcohol, domestic violence, and trauma than I did at 8 or 9. I know the situation was extremely serious. My sister could have been badly injured when he grabbed her. Any one of us could have been hurt if the door opened. My father could have attacked the police and been killed. The entire event could have ended differently in many ways. We were lucky. The necklace broke. My sister escaped. My mother reached the bedroom. The door locked. My father did not have a key. He was too drunk to think of kicking it down. The police arrived before he found a better way inside. Those small details kept us alive. Sometimes survival does not feel dramatic while it is happening. It feels like sitting on a bed, crying quietly, and listening to a knife scrape against the lock. I still do not know exactly what my father intended to do. Maybe I never will. But I remember the fear clearly enough to know what we believed. We believed he was going to break through the door. We believed he had a knife. And I truly believed he was trying to kill us.